8 anni, da quando insieme ad Aspen abbiamo immaginato la prima edizione del Transatlantic Forum. Ricordo che era il mese di febbraio, da pochi mesi la Russia si era annessa alla Crimea e si era aperta una prima frattura negli equilibri europei. Allora, quando organizzammo quel forum, il nostro obiettivo era quello di ospitare in un luogo neutro, quale può essere un istituto di cultura come il nostro, un dibattito che da un lato ponesse bene in evidenza lo spazio transatlantico, dall'altro però consentisse un confronto aperto anche con personalità, esperti che venivano dalla Russia. Dopo 8 anni, oggi, apriamo il nostro forum prendendo atto che quella iniziale frattura a cui ho fatto riferimento si è trasformata in una drammatica rottura. Viviamo e vediamo e assistiamo a un conflitto cruento militare nel suolo europeo. Da qui forse il tema del nostro forum, The Future of the West. Quale sarà il futuro dell'Occidente di fronte a questi fatti attualmente ci viviamo? Io vi chiedo scusa per introdurre i nostri lavori. La prendo un po' alla larga, da lontano. Per ricordare che esattamente 1910 anni fa, il 113 d.C., era più o meno questo periodo. Da qualche parte ho letto il mese di marzo, da qualche parte il mese di maggio, ma a poche centinaia di metri dal luogo dove ci troviamo veniva inaugurata la colonna traiana, che portava il nome dell'imperatore Traiano, ed era per conquistare l'annessione della Dacia. Ora, la Dacia, secondo la nomenclatura geografica di quel tempo, in fondo corrispondeva all'odierna Ucraina, all'odierna Romania. Se poi pensiamo che dopo la Dacia è stata la volta dell'Armenia, della Siria, della Mesopotamia, abbiamo visto l'impero romano raggiungere la sua massima estensione, quasi 5 milioni di chilometri quadrati. È Traiano, l'imperatore, che veniva definito l'Optimus Princeps, passò alla storia anche per questa colonna che testimonia con i suoi pregi sul marmo quelli che sono stati i progressi delle annessioni e delle conquiste romane. Ho detto prima che il nostro dibattito di oggi riguarderà il futuro dell'Occidente. Allora vorrei provare a suggerire una prima risposta, prendendo ispirazione dal passato e in particolare dal modello romano. Il modello romano si basava sulla tolleranza verso le altre tradizioni e verso le altre religioni e ha fatto proprio di questa diversità culturale il proprio asse portante. Allora vengo a tempi molto più recenti. Il 20 gennaio del 2001, George W. Bush, nel suo discorso di insediamento, disse: l'America non è mai stata unita per ragioni di sangue, di nascita o di territorio. Noi siamo legati da valori di fondo che ci muovono al di sopra della nostra quotidianità, ci sollevano al di sopra dei nostri interessi, ci insegnano cosa vuol dire essere cittadini. Ogni ragazzo deve essere educato a questi principi, ogni cittadino deve sostenerli e ogni immigrato, attraverso la condivisione di questi ideali, rende il nostro paese più e non meno americano. Beh, in fondo, nelle parole del presidente Bush, ritroviamo il principio che ha ispirato anche la cultura dell'impero romano, civis romanus sum. Allora, forse, per guardare al futuro, mi chiedo se non sia giusto partire da queste nostre radici, cioè dalla capacità che l'Occidente ha avuto di attrarre e assorbire popoli diversi, pur mantenendo sempre le loro peculiarità che comunque arricchiscono l'insieme. Questo potrebbe essere una visione sul futuro. Però perché questo accada, noi dobbiamo dimenticare l'aspetto geografico, fare riferimento a un'idea di civiltà. E l'Europa in questo può fare molto. Perché se noi parliamo di Occidente, oggi Occidente può essere Tokyo, Seul, perché non Gerusalemme o Kiev, se l'idea di civiltà è la stessa. Però dobbiamo anche non trascurare un'altra grande verità che ci viene dal passato e dal mondo romano, la libertà. Libertà declinata in vari modi, libertà dalle dominazioni straniere, libertà politica, libertà dell'individuo, che poi vuol dire vivere come vogliamo purché non danneggiamo nessun altro. Allora la libertà è un valore fondamentale, su di essa si basa anche il nostro modello politico, economico, sociale, dal momento che la libertà di fare impresa e di scambiare con il resto del mondo è un elemento essenziale per lo sviluppo delle nostre società. Arriviamo, così mi avvio a concludere, a questa tragica invasione russa dell'Ucraina. Una guerra che ha chiari risvolti strategici, un'importanza culturale e una valenza storica che potrebbe essere rilevante. E allora mi chiedo se forse proprio questa guerra non possa rappresentare una inaspettata, comunque deprecabile, occasione per riflettere su chi siamo, su chi vogliamo essere e soprattutto come possiamo ricompattarci tutti quanti. L'Ucraina ci sta impartendo una grande lezione, che la libertà, pur essendo un sacrosanto diritto, non è però scontata. Che la libertà è una conquista che tutti abbiamo il dovere di difendere. E però, perché questa accada, ci vuole un sistema di sicurezza e di difesa. Beh, l'impero romano contava 360.000 legionari, un esercito costosissimo, che manteneva fermi questi principi. Noi abbiamo oggi uno strumento che è altrettanto costoso, ma probabilmente molto più efficace. Abbiamo l'Organizzazione del Trattato Atlantico del Nord, la NATO. È sempre più moderna, è sempre più efficace nel simile. Allora io dico, teniamocelo da conto e confidiamo sul suo prezioso aiuto per la difesa dei nostri valori. Chiudo. Con questo convegno oggi cerchiamo di capire come immaginare il futuro dell'Occidente. Secondo me, per farlo, non dobbiamo perdere il passato, perché se conosciamo la nostra storia, così possiamo immaginare il nostro futuro. Quindi io penso che il dovere di noi tutti, e soprattutto di quanti di noi rivestono responsabilità nei vari settori politici, economici, sociali, è quello di consentire alle nuove generazioni che si affacciano al mondo di avere fiducia nel loro futuro. Perché, come è scritto nel libro del Kelet, una generazione va, una generazione viene, ma la terra è sempre la stessa. Con questo io vi auguro un buon lavoro in questo pomeriggio importante. Grazie.
Grazie al Presidente De Gennaro, grazie Gianni per l'ospitalità e grazie a tutti per l'attenzione. La guerra è venuta non solo improvvisa, ma anche relativamente imprevista. E questo è in qualche modo curioso. Ancora nel marzo del 2021 e poi nell'ottobre del 2021, nei comuniqué del G7 di Cardiff Bay o del G20 di Roma, si legge il comune e convinto impegno per la costruzione di un mondo migliore, mentre, evocato dai fantasmi del passato, veniva un mondo peggiore. Questa dell'Ucraina è una guerra che si manifesta su 3 dimensioni. La prima, quella del tempo. È ormai più di un anno che dura la guerra. Conosciamo la data iniziale, non possiamo neanche prevedere la data finale. Probabilmente una data non prossima, auspicabilmente una data almeno anticipata da un armistizio prima della data della pace. Ma in ogni caso la dimensione del tempo è molto importante, molto rilevante. Secondo, è una guerra che è estesa su un quadrante geopolitico sempre più alto, più vasto, coinvolge attori diversi, globali, gli Stati Uniti d'America, in prospettiva la Cina, scivola dal Mediterraneo all'Atlantico, al Pacifico. Viene in mente la guerra del Peloponneso di Tucidide, un volume esteso per 8 libri, una guerra che è durata 27 anni. La prospettiva è in un qualche modo critica. Terzo punto è la dimensione della ideologia che si sta sviluppando nel dominio economico. L'economia contemporanea risale alla formula di Adam Smith, la ricchezza delle nazioni. Abbiamo visto un periodo in cui la ricchezza contava più delle nazioni, il periodo della globalizzazione. Adesso i termini sembrano come invertiti. Non la ricchezza delle nazioni, ma le nazioni che determinano, insistono, influiscono su ampi strati dell'economia. Modificano i meccanismi della concorrenza, dell'intervento. Non credo corretto estremizzare come è stato fatto il 3 marzo sul Financial Times. Si dice che l'economia deve andare verso una wartime economy model. Io credo che questo sia eccessivo, ma certamente dobbiamo mettere in conto una pesante, crescente influenza della mano pubblica. Aspen Kiev nasce ufficialmente nel 2016 e rapidamente cresce per numero di iniziative e anche con il supporto di Aspen Italia. Con Aspen Italia, Aspen Kiev ha coorganizzato, io ricordo, un incontro sulla situazione dell'Ucraina, sulle implicazioni internazionali, ma nell'aprile del 2022, poche settimane prima dell'attacco della Russia. Ricordo in quell'occasione abbiamo svolto un dibattito molto aperto, in una logica che per Aspen è insieme transatlantica ed europea. La speranza è al più presto che si possa parlare della dimensione europea, dell'ingresso della dimensione europea della Ucraina. Grazie.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Poiché sto ancora imparando la vostra bellissima lingua, terrò il mio discorso in inglese. So, I want to thank our friends at the Centro Studi Americani, the Aspen Institute, and the European Council on Foreign Relations for organizing this afternoon's event. It's an honor to be here with Presidents De Gennaro and Tremonti and to welcome so many distinguished experts. Just over 1 year ago, my predecessor spoke at this same podium for the 2022 Transatlantic Forum as Russia was preparing its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. He said, quote, "What this crisis is about at its core is Russia's rejection of a post-Cold War Europe that is whole and free. It is about Russia turning away from agreements that have kept the peace across the continent for decades, taking aim at NATO and at the governing principles of international peace, security, and democracy that we all have a stake in defending. To allow Russia to violate these principles with impunity would drag us back to a much more dangerous and unstable time and send a message to others around the world that these principles are expendable." Those words are as true today as they were 1 year ago. Russia's brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine is one of the most significant events of this century. The long war has global implications, requiring a strong, united, and decisive transatlantic response. Putin thought he could roll over Kiev, and the transatlantic community was too divided to respond. To Putin's surprise, the Ukrainian population have defended themselves effectively with courage and ingenuity. To Putin's consternation, the transatlantic community has rallied to assist the people of Ukraine. To Putin's dismay, his attempt to annex another country's territory has failed. The one-year mark of this conflict did not see a victory parade by Putin in Kiev or in Moscow. Instead, it brought valiant resistance by the people of Ukraine against a foreign power seeking to take away their freedom and their right to choose their own government. It brought a barrage of Russian and Iranian-made missiles and drones, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure to deprive the population of electricity and of water. It brought further evidence of Russian atrocities and war crimes that are, in the words of Vice President Harris, an assault on our common values and common humanity. It also brought President Zelensky to Washington, to Brussels, and to many European capitals. It brought visits to Kiev by President Biden, Prime Minister Maloney, and many others. The broad coalition supporting Ukraine speaks volumes about the kind of world in which both Americans and Europeans want to live. Russia's attack elicited a commitment by Europeans to invest the resources required to defend themselves and their allies from aggression. Historically neutral states such as Sweden and Finland asked to become members of NATO. All of us are now much more focused on the importance of security for energy resources and supply chains, topics that are important to every person and every business facing high energy prices and inflation. Transatlantic teamwork is needed now more than ever, even in areas where we sometimes have different paths towards the same goal. For example, some European states have raised questions about the US Inflation Reduction Act, which will address global climate change. We believe there are opportunities for European firms in the IRA, as well as benefits to EU energy security. We are discussing our respective positions in a joint task force with the European Union and have already made progress on certain issues. Since we are meeting here in Rome, I note that Italy has been a key component of the transatlantic response to the war in Ukraine. The Italian people welcomed 170,000 Ukrainian refugees. Italy has donated millions in humanitarian assistance. And Italy has also provided equipment to allow Ukrainians to defend their families, their cities, and their independence. Italy has also led the way in encouraging other EU states to offer Ukraine a real European perspective. This willingness to stand up for its values, the values it holds dear, has reinforced Italy's position as a leader in NATO, in the EU, and in the G7. During his visit to Kiev, President Biden told the Ukrainian people, and I quote, "You remind us that freedom is priceless. It's worth fighting for as long as it takes. And that's how long we're going to be with you, for as long as it takes." By the we, the president did not just mean the United States. He meant Italy. He meant the EU. He meant NATO, and he meant the broader transatlantic community. Let me close by stating that the United States is committed now as before to strengthening NATO, raising the level of ambition in the US-EU relationship, and standing together with our European partners in defense of the rules-based system that underpins our security, our prosperity, and our values. Grazie.
Good afternoon and welcome to this first panel of our Transatlantic Forum today. I am very pleased that we will have Kurt Volker with us here on stage. We will also have Oksana Antonenko from the Kennedy Institute. She will join us online. And Ambassador Paolo Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, is also going to be with us online. I was told that Ambassador Dobriansky will need to leave in 55 minutes. And around 4:45, we're also going to have the closing remarks from Hanna Halchenko from the Ukrainian embassy in Rome. So this is on the housekeeping side. We have I think the optimistically framed panel here to deal with. It's the panel about the consolidation of the West. And this is one of the best news, I think, that this war produced. Vladimir Putin succeeded really to consolidate Europe and the US and to consolidate the broader West, to consolidate Europe within the EU, but also, as it turns out, to consolidate the European societies. At the European Council on Foreign Relations, we've just published a survey, a global survey that we did in 9 European countries, plus the UK, plus a couple of countries from elsewhere. We polled in the US, in India, in China, in Turkey, and in Russia. And the results of those polls are actually that for the first time since the beginning of the war in February last year, in Europe, there is almost no difference in terms of the public opinion between governments, between publics and governments, but also both sides of the Atlantic are extremely unified and consolidated. This great effect of Putin's aggression in Ukraine was not a given. We know that we were talking about the terrible winter that was to expect us. We were worried about the course of the war. And many were probably thinking that Ukraine is not going to sustain. Fortunately, all of this actually proved otherwise. And here we are at a point where we can actually be there for Ukraine, but also defend our own security together. With that, I will give the floor now to Oksana Antonenko, and hear maybe first from her how you feel the West is seen, but also do you think that this very positive trend could be at risk? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. So indeed, we are now here 1 year after the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, but we're also here 9 years since the illegal referendum was held in Crimea and the region was illegally annexed by Russia. So we are already in this very long war. It has not been lasting for a year. It has been now lasting for almost a decade. And clearly we are still very much in the midst of it. And as Mr. Tremonti said, there's still great uncertainty as to where and how this conflict is going to end. What do we know so far? I think it's important to point out. The first one, of course, is that Ukraine has been more strong than anybody ever expected, certainly more than Russia expected. And Ukraine now is not only defending heroically itself, but it's also defending European security as a whole. And as such, it has really become part of, or central part of the European security, and very much, of course, part of the European family, now credibly on the path towards European Union membership and NATO membership, something which has not been guaranteed before this full-scale invasion has started. The second thing that we know is that Russia is actually much weaker than we anticipated before this invasion started. First of all, of course, Russia has been weaker on the battlefield. It was not able to achieve any of its strategic objectives, and it's clear now that it will not be able to achieve its strategic objectives. But it's also been much weaker geopolitically than we expected, because so far we have not seen any allies that Russia had in the world which were prepared to fully align with Russia's position. Of course, Russia has received some support from Iran, as was mentioned before, from North Korea. Rhetoric, it's about the sort of fault of NATO enlargement has been accepted or repeated in parts of the world. I'm joining you here from Brazil, and there's some people that are still repeating that, but no one has fully aligned with Russia's version of this war. And I think it is really important to emphasize how isolated Russia is geopolitically. And we, of course, seeing very interestingly that it's this isolation is now rapidly transforming not only the western part of the post-Soviet area, but also the Caucasus and Central Asia. We've seen a recent visit by Secretary Blinken, of course, which clearly demonstrated that Central Asian states, although they are still part of the same institutions like Eurasian Economic Union or Collective Security Treaty Organization, but they are actively now looking for ways to distance themselves from Russia and to develop closer relationship with the United States and with Europe. And we should not miss this opportunity to not only offer the perspective to Ukraine, but also, looking to transform the relationship, make them more ambitious in other parts of the former Soviet Union. The third thing that we know from this conflict is that the West has been consolidated, and we have seen, as many other speakers said before me, that NATO has become stronger. There is now excellent opinion poll from ECFR showing that there is almost no difference now between Central Europeans and Northern Europeans or other members of the European Union and their perception towards Russia. However, of course, we also now are in a situation where the European security system as a whole, which we built, collectively since the end of the Cold War, has not been effective to prevent this war from breaking out. And now we have all the institutions of this confrontation with Russia that existed during the Cold War, but has now been completely demolished. And Russia's withdrawal from the Strategic Arms Control Treaty just the other day really indicates that we now have no institutions to manage this long-term confrontation left. There is no arms control, there is no collective security system effectively which can manage this long-term security challenge in Europe, which we are likely to have for decades to come potentially. Regardless of how this conflict is going to end. And the final point, that what we also know from this conflict now is that the rest of the world, we still see a lot of countries that are very much sitting on the fence Although, as I said, no one has clearly aligned themselves with Russia's position. But there are still a lot of countries around the world, and some very important ones, the India, as we see now with the G20 presidency, Turkey, Gulf states, of course, China, that are really prioritizing the time, as Mr. Tremonti said, over principles in how this conflict should end. They're looking for a quick ending, regardless of what the terms are of this ending, partly because, of course, the spillovers from this conflict are very substantial in terms of the global economy. Now, let me quickly just point out, 3 things that we still do not know of what the future holds. The first one is that, of course, we want to see Ukraine sustaining its incredibly impressive performance on the battlefield, but we certainly need much greater military support for Ukraine, for it to be able to retake back all the territories that have been taken by Russia since February 24, and actually since the start of this conflict 9 years ago. And so far, of course, we so far have seen in the last few months the war of attrition, where the front line has not really moved very much. And it is very important that we see those successes that Ukraine has achieved on the battlefield last summer repeated again this summer, because if we are falling into the situation of this prolonged war of attrition, I think we will see potentially more challenges in sustaining the international coalition, particularly if the economic consequences are also remain severe. The second thing that we really do not know is whether this conflict is going to remain contained in Ukraine, or whether we are going to see the greatest spillovers from this conflict in the region. And so far, those spillovers came in the form of refugees, in the form of energy prices. But so far, we have not seen any military spillovers. But as I mentioned before, now in the absence of the infrastructure of confrontation with Russia, I think the spillovers are becoming more likely. And although, of course, we know now that Russia really doesn't have many red lines that President Putin has talked before, the West is supplying weapons. We see Ukraine now staging some attacks in Crimea and even some perhaps on the territory of Russia itself. But the risk of spillovers are still very substantial. And the final point that we do not know is what the relationship between Russia and China are going to be going forward. And this is absolutely critically important, that although China has so far supported some of the Russian rhetoric, it has not provided substantial military assistance to Russia. And as we know now from various statements coming out of Washington, but also other parts of the world, that China perhaps is now more engaged in the conversation with Russia about potential military assistance. And should that assistance be forthcoming, I think we are likely to see this conflict transforming into much more global and dangerous conflict, which could have a very substantial consequences for the West beyond just what we've seen so far. So preventing that kind of entry of China into this conflict is absolutely critically important. So I'll stop here.
You said Russia was isolated internationally, yet you spoke about the role of China. Do you want to maybe address that a little bit? How isolated is Russia currently vis-a-vis China?
Well, I think Russia is isolated insofar as I said that no country in the world has fully aligned with Russia in this conflict. Of course, we've seen some countries like Iran and North Korea providing assistance with ammunition, with drones, but none of those countries has fully aligned. Iran has been so far denying that it's providing military assistance. China, of course, as I said, is playing a critically important role. And yes, China continues to endorse some of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow that NATO enlargement has been the source of this conflict. But China has been incredibly careful, particularly Chinese, businesses, companies, and government as well, in providing the economic assistance for Russia, for example, to help it to mitigate the impact of sanctions. In many ways, Turkey has been more instrumental now in Russia avoiding some sanctions than China. And I think that's quite remarkable. But at the same time, of course, China has its own red lines, and we have not yet tested those red lines. And I think from my perspective, an analytical perspective, and of course also talking to some of the Chinese counterparts, I think one of those red lines is if Russia were to descend into a civil conflict or into a real instability and collapse, seeing instability on China's northern border, given that China is increasingly dependent also on Russia for import of its energy resources, is something that China will seek to avoid. And if that kind of perspective of Russia descending into that instability as a result of its military defeat or as a result of political instability in Russia, China is more likely to provide more significant assistance. And the second one, I think, substantial red line that China has been always very vocal about is some change within Russia, which can bring about a more pro-Western regime in Russia. Of course, at the moment, we see no prospect of that change coming. But clearly, we know that Russia is going to go through a very substantial political turmoil as a result of its failure to achieve its strategic objectives in Ukraine. So should that prospect of political change in Russia becomes more realistic, again, it is more likely that China is actually going to step in and support the current regime, which they see to be strategically more aligned and important to China. So there are a lot of things that China is watching. It is not imminent, in my view, that China will enter the conflict, but there are potential drivers that can make that entry more likely.
Thank you very much. I think we can immediately now go to Ambassador Dobryansky with a similar set of questions. How isolated is Russia? Is it the West versus the rest, or is it a more nuanced picture? In our ECFR poll, we found out that the Western public opinions were imagining the world of tomorrow much more in kind of two block terms, while the rest of the world sees the world much more as a multipolar reality. If you would maybe also like to give us your opinion on that.
Right. Well, buongiorno. Thank you. Let me first thank all of the organizers. I'd like to thank Presidente Di Gennaro and also Presidente Tremonti. I wish I could be there in Rome. Sadly, I'm in Washington, D.C., but wish I could be there with all of you for this very timely forum. I'd like to take your questions and integrate them, if I may, into the broader point about the fact that this is, it's the long war and its global implications, and take some of the points you just raised and integrate them. Let me first start with, Oksana was so right to point out that on this anniversary of this 1 year, that it's not just 1 year. She's right to point out that with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Donbass back in 2014, that this has been a long war. It has been going on for some time. It's, I think, important to note that as part of our approach, and when we look at all of the players in this case, an element that is crucial is that there needs to be a strategic approach. We've had many different policies, whether they've been in the economic and sanctions track or the military track, humanitarian track. But I think that as we come together and look at this issue in this Transatlantic Forum, that we need to step back and look at it from a strategic perspective, not just only what are the requirements and the reaction of the day. I think one of the most important and significant impacts has been certainly that the post-World War II order has been called into question. Here, a country's sovereignty and territorial integrity has been challenged. And, you know, by what has happened here, a type of precedent has been set, and one which all those around the globe are watching, particularly those autocrats in other parts of the globe and the other parts of the world are looking at, what does this mean for us? Xi Jinping certainly is looking at how this unfolds and then what steps or ramifications that will be for China's desire for Taiwan. Here also, there's the question of the fact that there's basically an attempt, a brutal, unprecedented, and violent attempt to change, borders by force and coercion. This is unacceptable. The rules, the standards of a post-World War order have been definitively called into question, and they have to be defended. They have to be also sustained. In this process, it's also imperative that part of the implication here is that Putin himself cannot be allowed to get away with violating these principles. Clearly, other autocrats are looking at what kind of successes, what kind of outcome here unfolds, and what that will mean for them and for their own desires and how much they will be emboldened. I think also it is important to point out that there are some very significant economic long-term implications here that have had a dramatic impact. Clearly, one of the most significant shifts that has to be mentioned is the transformation of the energy space. Here, Moscow has engaged, as we've seen over years, of a weaponization of gas and also oil. As a result, we have witnessed a very significant implication has been that countries have diversified their energy policies, their energy supplies and approaches, and also have taken a more independent stance. Very significantly, Germany now has gone to the establishment of an LNG terminal, which it did not have before. So very, very important shift in terms of energy. There are other clear geopolitical implications. The resolve of NATO itself, as has already been pointed out, I think is very significant. The fact that NATO has been expanded, Sweden, Finland, I think that this has very critical and crucial meaning. There's a point that has not been mentioned, which does have longer term ramifications, and that's the question of the nuclear issue, the non-proliferation. What do I mean here? I'm not speaking of the various treaties, but quite frankly, looking at those countries like Iran, North Korea, they saw that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, as we know, in the context of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. They gave up those weapons in return for the protection of their territorial integrity and sovereignty. And so other countries that have very aggressive agendas and very agendas that are going to tear at the very fiber and fabric of the World War II, post World War II order, are looking at the maintenance of the nuclear path, and that they do not want to sidetrack their nuclear resolve. This comes at a crucial time. Then there's the challenge also that's posed with countries like India. Oksana mentioned this. I think it's an important point. India is the largest democracy, and in this context, India depends on Russia for Russia is its #1 weapons supplier. At the same time, India has also upped its oil that it's getting from Russia in this case. And so the challenge, the complexity going forward, the United States has a strategic partnership with India. Then let me come to the question of China and Russia. Here.
Ho un catetere io o no?
Sì.
I
Sì,
think
cioè posso,
there seems to
quindi
be
posso
another voice.
lasciare andare o ci va?
Sì, guardi, ciao, queste sacche di qui sono collegate direttamente in vescica. Quindi questo di qua è il liquido, entra in vescica, fa il lavaggio e poi fuoriesce all'interno della sacca che c'è
Perché
qui.
io ho un po' di fitte qua
Hello, can you still hear me?
Can you just hold on 1 second? We're
Okay.
trying to fix this.
Thank you. I was looking for your
technical-
voice.
we
Thank
will
you.
mute you for a moment.
Has it been muted?
I think it's working now.
Okay, it sounds,
I think we lost you at the moment when you were about to start talking about China and the rest.
okay, thank you. I have a few more points, thank you. So specifically here about the relationship of China and Russia. Actually, what's significant here, we have witnessed a growing and close relationship. Russia has given not only arms and has been upping China's, in fact, China's military base, but also if you look at the figures, the economic relationship has been one that has also grown exponentially. And then also in this context, we know the kind of position that China has taken, although it speaks to the sovereignty and rules of countries. Nevertheless, China has chosen to virtually back Russia in this case. But I think it's important to point out that the relationship has not been a divergent one. On the contrary, it's been one that has become closely aligned. I wrote a piece with Steve Hadley a few years ago in which we were examining the course and the trend of the relationship, and even prior to the recent invasion, the February 24 invasion that of last year, China and Russia have become much closer politically, economically, and no less militarily. And quite significantly, if you look at the extent to which Russia and China, also the leaders, Xi and Putin meet, it's now something like some 50 times. So I want to point that out because here I think that that's an issue that needs to be taken into account in the long run. Here, in terms of, you asked the question about the perspective on Russia. I would say that there have been significant reverberations around the globe because of this invasion, because of global food insecurity. Countries like Egypt, which rely very heavily on Ukraine for their grain. Interestingly enough, China also relies and has a high percentage of reliance on Ukraine for grain. So here, many countries of the global south, if you will have resented, have looked at Russia's actions here and the invasion of having a very severe economic effect. We know, I already referenced the growing energy crisis, and in which the perception of Russia was the weaponization of energy. And in particular here, the track of moving forward and trying to diversify. The most significant one that I pointed out is Germany. there's been a fundamental disruption of broader global supply chains, which we have seen in which many Asian countries have also taken out their manufacturing out of also, in this case, China, because of the lack of reliance there and the position China also has taken relative to Russia. So here, let me just say that rules have been violated, that the economic reverberations are very significant. And let me add in two last points and then close. I think that the humanitarian, also a component, has to be mentioned here. It's very tragic, this issue where Russia has taken Ukrainian children and brought them into Russian territory. The figures have been significant in terms of the number of children. The Ukrainian government wants these children back. This was a criminal action. And then there are the humanitarian implications. Here, the refugees, the internally displaced Ukrainians, the impact this has on many European countries, including Italy itself. So let me conclude by saying that here, I think that one of the issues that's very important in looking forward, the military, as Oksana mentioned, is a key. Being united on the transatlantic front and providing Ukraine with the kind of military assistance that it needs to be successful here. So there's the goal of Ukraine having success in the war, but also there must be success at the peace. And here, another important element now and going forward is reconstruction in Ukraine. That process has already begun. It is a key for the modernization of Ukraine, key for also elimination of corruption in Ukraine, key for also preserving and having security and stability in an important country in the continent of Europe. Let me end there.
Thank you very much. It would be great if you could stay on for as long as your time permits. I'm sure there will be also questions. We know that you have
I will be staying on for another 25 minutes.
25 minutes, yes. Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Kurt Volker from the Center for European Policy Analysis, but we have all known him for his long expertise also in this part of Europe, including Ukraine. Paolo Dobriansky just mentioned the successful end of the war. I don't know if you want to take this on, but what is a successful end of the war? Because depending on whom you ask, I guess you can get very different answers. You may get one answer in Poland, another answer in France, a different answer probably in the US. And if you ask in Brazil or in India, I guess you will hear, this is a remote regional war. We don't care that much about it, but we want it to finish. And so they don't care about what a successful end means. They care about it happening fast. And so if you want to take this on, but there were also a bunch of points that were just mentioned in passing, the transformation of energy space, the nuclear issue, all things that I'm sure you can tell us more about.
Thank you very much. Sure. And Paula, I'm sorry you're not here as well. It would be wonderful to see you. And if you were here, you'd see in the audience a number of mutual friends as well who've come out for this. Fernando Soleo, Sergio Vento, Carlos Aragona, Ricardo Perisic, many others. So you are missed physically, even if we got to hear you virtually. And let me also thank Marta Basu, Giulio Tremonti, Aspen Italia, Centro Studi Americani, everybody. It's wonderful to be here and it's a great opportunity. Let me answer your question by starting in a big context and working back down. This was said already by Oksana. It was also said at the very beginning by the president of the center here. We have to understand that Putin's war against Ukraine is a war against Europe. It is a war against European values, the idea of a Ukrainian people and an identity having a right to a nation. It's a war against freedom. It's a war against the European security architecture, which rests upon the idea of there being international borders that are secure and respected. That's everything coming from the Helsinki Final Act through the Charter of Paris and beyond. And it was mentioned that it's a long war because it didn't start in 2022. It's already been a year since then, but there was a war going on in 2014. Frankly, you could look at the Yanukovych regime as a form of Putin's war against Ukraine, trying to control it through his own regime. And you can go back before that to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he literally tore up the European security architecture and then invaded Georgia in 2008. Or you can go back before that, when he said in 2005 that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And everything he has done since then is to try to rebuild a Russian empire on the territory of the former Soviet Union. And this is a danger to all of Europe. It is an ideology that he has that is based partly in a fascist ideology of denying the rights of others and an imperialist ideology which claims a right to rule over others. And as long as this is existing in Europe, then Europe is not secure. So that, I think, is the big framework for understanding this war. And what that means is the future of Europe, the future of a transatlantic community, really depends on the future of Russia's war against Ukraine. How does this come out? If Putin wins, if Putin succeeds in toppling the government of Ukraine, taking territory by force, keeping it and remaining in power, then Putin will do it again. And so we have a weakened transatlantic community in a hostile environment. And the alternative is if Ukraine wins, defeats Russian forces, then you can start to see the beginning of the foundations of security for Europe. And that's what we need to be aiming to. Now, what does a Ukraine victory look like? What is the end of the war? And I'd say it's a couple of things. And they are rested on this values basis that we're talking about. The first thing is obviously the defeat of Russia's military. As long as Russia's military is capable of continuing to fight, they will. That's Putin giving the orders, and Putin has made his logic and his determination very clear. He wants to take Ukraine, he wants to replace the government, he feels justified in doing so, and he has staked his personal prestige and legacy as president of Russia for 22 years on this point. So the Russian military forces have to be defeated. When that happens, it is critical that Russia go through a reconciliation with its actions, with its deeds, much as Germany did after World War II, much as Japan did after World War II, as Italy did, recognizing that a regime in that country committed horrible crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, in the name of the people, in the name of the society of that country. And Russia needs to have a reconciliation, recognizing what its leaders, Vladimir Putin and others, have done in the name of the Russian people. And that means being a period of accountability for war crimes. There needs to be a war crimes tribunal. It means a reparations for Ukraine, support for Ukraine to rebuild what Russia has destroyed. So these points of accountability and reconciliation with its deeds are important. And then following from that is Russia agreeing to live within its own borders. We were all wrong about many things, but one of the things we've been wrong about for almost 30 years is a tacit acceptance that Russia can occupy the territory of other countries and get away with it. We don't have special rules like that for anybody else in Europe. And it turns out that by accepting this over time, as we did, it only encouraged Putin to go again and to take more. And so the end of this war, I think it's a critical point now. Russia must agree to live within its own borders. And then we come to the point of what is the security of the rest of Europe. And here it's already been decided by the European Union that Ukraine is a candidate for EU membership and will eventually become an EU member. I also believe that Ukraine must become a member of NATO. There is no other security arrangement in Europe that works. We've tried a few others. We tried the Budapest Memorandum. It didn't have the commitment and the teeth needed. And from a purely political point of view, I don't believe that there is security for Ukraine without an American security guarantee. And I don't believe any American politician will give Ukraine a security guarantee alone. We will insist that our allies do the same. And so I think the only way forward is Ukraine to be a member of NATO. And then that gets to the point of what about the rest of Europe then? We faced this war in Ukraine because we left gray zones. We left Ukraine in limbo. We left states in the Balkans in limbo. And these are still areas of instability. Sweden and Finland, as was mentioned in the first set of remarks here, have made the decision that it's not safe to be in limbo. You need to be anchored in NATO. And I think we need to have a fresh view of membership in European institutions, transatlantic institutions to include NATO, for all of those countries that now find themselves in a gray zone. They have to meet the standards. Let's be clear, we're not talking about lowering standards, but they need to know the commitment to possible membership is real. And that, in my view, that clarity about what the West is and that we are willing to take the steps to define and defend the West is the strongest statement we can give in the face of competition and confrontation, perhaps, with China.
Great, thanks a lot. One final last question from me to you, Kurt. When you talked about define and defend the West, this year at the Munich Security Conference, there was a very robust US delegation, which was great. This was not the case some years ago when there was much more skepticism in Washington vis-a-vis Europe. But the other very different picture in Munich this year was also the presence of the global South. And there were quite a lot of Asians, Africans, Latin Americans. When you think about this picture, coming back to the question of bipolar, multipolar world, what kind of world order you think can emerge from the shambles of this world?
That's a great question. And I'll answer it rhetorically with a question first. If we are divided and doubt ourselves and doubt our victory, why would the global South believe in us? So we have to get it right in our own minds first to project where we think this goes. And in that context, what is getting it right in our own minds mean? We have to think of ourselves in a constant competition between two ideas about governance. One is about people who are able to choose and change their governments and act as citizens in their societies and are building things for their people. And the other is authoritarian systems that are governed by a few, designed to rule over the masses who are not citizens but subjects, and are there for the benefit of the few. And the latter systems would include the current Russian state, it would include China, it would include Iran. And the good news about the Western model of thinking of people as citizens that choose and change their governments is that is what people all over the world want. They just don't have it in all cases. And we need to be a clear expression of that in our own societies, which we are struggling with right now. We all have our internal issues, and we need to be able to articulate those things and stand for them internationally. And that's the most we can hope to do to be persuasive in a global South. And I understand their philosophy of, look, this is just another form of colonialism. We had our share of it, not our problem. But in the end of the day, it's everybody's problem because it rests on this fundamental division of values.
Great. I can now open the floor also to the audience here. We have three great, very capable speakers. So please shoot. There were quite a lot of questions, I think, that they started elaborating on. Martha, do you allow me to take the question in the back first? Okay. Can you, I'll give you a microphone. There is a microphone. No, we need it for the, so that they can hear
Okay,
you.
thank you. Congratulations on a great summary of what the status is right now. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I wanted to share my thoughts with you and get your ideas on this.
Can you introduce
Oh,
yourself?
I'm Mark Welzer. I'm retired. Anybody who sees Flight Radar 24, which is this app, you see the huge empty space. Nobody can fly there. So airlines are just flying all over. Russia has mainly now Western airplanes. I'm both like I'm going back a bit, but it's very important. Because of the sanctions, Russia cannot get spare parts. My feeling, I've been saying this to my friends, I want to know your view on it. Canary in the gold mine is eventually, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when some Russian airplane, commercial airplanes carrying civil passengers are going to fall because of lack of maintenance. And that will wake up the Russian population and tell the president, I think you're doing something wrong. So my view is, my idea is, it's a tragedy that one or more civilian airliners fall because of lack of maintenance, and that's going to wake up everything. I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
If you allow me, I will split this in two questions. One question is on the effect of sanctions, because I think this is an important one. And the second question is, can a regime change happen from within, right? Would Russians go to toppling the regime? Any other questions on sanctions maybe in the room? No, okay. Or anything for that matter, but I thought Oksana, and then Paolo Dobriansky, and then we'll come back to Clay. Oksana, over to you.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a good question, but so far we have seen that Russia is able to procure spare parts for the planes on the parallel import market. Yes, not all the critically important spare parts, but a lot of them. So it's purchasing all over the world. And of course, we also have a model of Iran model, of Iran, which has been operating Western planes for a very long time under sanctions and is now able to produce some of the spare parts on its own. So although, of course, it's very worrying that Russia is not subjecting its planes, very large number, but more than 1,000 planes to proper technical expertise of the manufacturers, in Boeing or Airbus, but it is able to procure spare parts in bypassing the sanctions. So I wouldn't think that this is going to be the key trigger point anytime soon, which can actually generate public change. In fact, Russian state has now provided very large subsidies to allow those planes to fly within Russia. Those planes, of course, because they were seized illegally, they cannot fly outside Russia, but they are flying inside Russia and to many parts of Russia where planes never flew before. So in many ways, the public support is actually so far has been only increasing about this connectivity in the Far East, etc. But if we go to a more general point, so far, although Russia has clearly demonstrated itself to be much weaker militarily than we expected, its economy actually held up relatively okay, given the scale of sanctions that have been so far imposed. Last year, Russian economy only shrank by under 3% of GDP, which is substantially lower than what Russia experienced either in the global financial crisis or, of course, in the 1990s. So I think much will depend on whether sanctions on Russian energy resources, particularly the refined oil products, actually are going to be properly enforced. And of course, oil price cap has so far been more effective than many analysts have suggested. But so far, we have not seen Russian economy really collapsing. Many economists, think that the economy is going to hold up for a couple more years and then really fall off the cliff. But even this year, it's unlikely that we are going to see Russian economy shrinking by more than 3-4%. So we have to be patient, even with the sanctions. I think the economic deterioration in Russia and kind of economic collapse, so to speak, is still a long way away. Now, the state, of course, is able to redistribute the revenues that it's receiving from export of oil and other commodities to primarily direct this money towards the constituencies that are supporting the regime. So as a result of it, we have not seen high unemployment. We have not seen, particularly among the kind of lower middle class or poorer people, any substantial economic impacts. Of course, the middle class and the more, internationally integrated people, parts of the economy have suffered, but it probably accounts to about 15% of Russian economy, or maybe less. It is clear that the economic situation is not going to be the main one, which is going to drive public sort of opposition to the regime. I think the losses on the battlefield potentially could be much more significant factor, which can weaken the regime from within. And although the propaganda is extremely strong and the majority of people do not get an objective picture of what is actually happening on the battlefield, I think more and more families are being impacted by mobilization, and they receive information not from the television, but from those who went through the front and who experienced all this horrendous treatment that the Russian servicemen are now subjected to, with no proper weapons, no proper clothes, with no support from other parts of the military. So this kind of situation can maybe precipitate more of opposition. But unlike, for example, the war in Chechnya, where we've seen the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, the civil society at that time in 1990s really taking a stand. Now, because the regime has become really dictatorial, we really have not seen so far any of those organizations, voicing serious opposition to the war. So the opinion polls, to the extent we can judge, even from the more independent pollsters like Levada, are still showing the support for the war is holding strong with, more than 70% of those people who are prepared to answer. And of course, only every 10th person is answering the pollsters at the moment, but still only those people who are answering. So in that sense, I doubt that we will see any change to the regime.
Thank you very much, Oksana. I will immediately pass on to the mic to both of us because I know it has only a couple of minutes left.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm not going to address the aviation issue because I think Oksana already answered your question quite robustly, but I want to add 2 points. The first is on sanctions. I do think sanctions do have an impact in the context when they're targeted and they're sustained, because here, and I say it more broadly, here, because there are certain sanctions, particularly in the energy space, which are providing income and fueling Russia's war machine, no matter how flawed Russia's war machine has turned out to be. It's striking to me that Russia concluded a pipeline deal with the Chinese at great disadvantage to themselves. And they did so because they know that the other market, the European market, and other markets were shifting on them. And there is a strong desire to sustain basically that kind of income flow. So I'd first make the point, I do think sanctions have an impact. I wouldn't equate that is going to be the factor that will bring a close to this or the most significant leverage in closing this. But I do think it does strangulate their actions. I do think it strangulates also the monies that are going into their military operation. And energy actually, and spare parts relative to energy actually matter greatly. But we also know that Russia has been able to get resources, like I mentioned India earlier, where India, if you look at it, has really significantly upped the percentage of its oil coming in, and that it has purchased from Russia. So finally, on sanctions, I would add that I think one of the most significant sanction, which has not been targeted, is against the Russian central bank. Because again, it depends on what one is speaking of here that can really have some impact and leverage. But sanctions do matter overall. They have a deteriorating impact. They also will that change public opinion. Here, I do agree with Oksana. I think that actually public opinion has been more affected by, first, the term a special military operation. No one knows what that is. There were defections on the Ukrainian battlefield by Russian soldiers, many of whom sold tanks actually to the Ukrainians. And thirdly, you also have a high percentage, I believe the figure now is some 200,000 of Russians who have died on the battlefield. And you saw that when there were conscripts of bringing in younger men, they were leaving the country. So I think that just the terms of what's happening here has certainly affected public opinion, because we know that the reason and the rationale is one that has not been, I would say, embraced, particularly by a younger generation in Russia. If I may just say one last word, because I will be signing off, I do want to just go back to a core point and that Kurt made, and that is on this question about success. Success is crucial. And a number, not only Kurt, but in the opening remarks that were made, this was underscored. And Zelensky himself has said this over and over. It isn't only about the war in Ukraine, that it is also about the impact and implications for European security, NATO, the alliance, the global community at large. It's impacted not only militarily, it's impacted economically, humanitarian wise, and so many different ways, no less politically, in terms of the particular values that we hold so dearly and which have been discarded and undermined, not just by only Russia, but also by China. That's why we are living in an era of great power competition, and one which unites both Russia and China at this time, and I don't see it diverging. Both of them have been united by a desire to undermine not only, I would say, the influence of the United States, the West at large, but also have worked hard to try to fragment our alliance, our transatlantic unity of purpose, and no less our partnerships with other countries. And I think that is a critical implication here, and in one in which we must be united. So success in Ukraine matters not just only for the future of Ukraine, but it matters for the European community at large and the global community. I want to just say thank you again for having invited me, and my apologies for having to leave a little bit early. I wish I could stay, but I'll look forward to another time to come to Rome and to see many of the friends who Kurt had identified in the audience, and no less my very distinguished panelists. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Kurt, do you want to come to the back to the sanctions and begin change point?
If you would like me to, or otherwise, I think we
Is
can
there
hear
two
from some
more
others.
questions?
Let's,
And then maybe we can
let's do
start
that.
from you. Marta, and then there is the gentleman in the back, and then we'll come around the room.
If I may follow up along these lines, success is crucial. I completely agree. And Paula very rightly said, and you also heard, not only for Ukraine, which is already something very important, but for European security as a whole. So the follow-up question is, what happened if military success does not materialize? Because I agree that Russia, from a political point of view, has already lost. And also on the ground, the first year of the war was not encouraging for Russia. And yet, we cannot assume by definition that Ukraine is able to win the war. So what happens in that case, in that negative scenario? Because if our assumption is right, that success is unavoidable in a sense from our viewpoint, because the stakes are so high, we come to a point in which we will be forced to take up other decisions, and the war could in the end become a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. How do we assess this possibility, this scenario?
Thank you, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. I have a very simple question. Apart from the character of this war, which you have so well described, this is also an info war. And the info war, this war has been based very much, particularly in Russia, on the massive, outstrappers, massive of lies that have been propagated all inside Russia, inside the rest of the world, and inside even the Western countries, our television. My question is very simple. What are we doing to counter this? I mean, because the people in Russia, I have friends in Russian friends here who tell me that the common people in Moscow are actually tranquilly. I mean, they think that the war is going on. They think it's a terrible story, but I mean, they're not aware that their enemy is their country and not NATO.
The war of the narratives, as we put it. There was a question here, and then one in the back. There is here.
Of course, you gave
brilliant analysis. And I think you were absolutely right in making the parallel between Putin's Russia and Germany of the first half of the 20th century. The question is, yeah, and the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians, we all had our Zeitenwende after the defeat. The question is that we are not going to occupy Moscow, and we cannot foresee how and when a change in regime in Russia will take place and in which direction. So all these are, and we cannot speculate on hypotheses, which means that what you describe as the end game couldn't possibly be called peace, because peace is what we had in Europe, or at least in Western Europe, after the end of the World War II and the defeat of Nazi Germany. What will come after the war in Ukraine will not be peace. What will it be? Presumably, it will be a ceasefire. Ceasefire is something very different from peace. That it implies at least three things. The first is that sanctions will have to remain. The second is that Ukraine will require, as you said, that's a very important point, a type of Western guarantee that will equal membership of NATO, even if for some reason is not exactly membership of NATO. But that's the only thing that could guarantee Ukrainian security after the ceasefire. The third question, which is probably the most important, is on which borderline the ceasefire is going to happen. Because common sense tells you that if there is a ceasefire, it will be some type of Korean situation that is going to last for a very, very long time. Which makes me think that the last thing that we have to do, if we want to preserve Western unity right now, is to try to speculate too much on the end game. Since Putin, and not without reason, thinks that time is on his side, because Western solidarity may be fragile, because the Ukrainians may not last, etc. So the only thing that matters now is to accelerate military support and try to push the line for a possible ceasefire as far as possible. Which brings me, and European solidarity, I think, is not in question. The people like the Germans, the French, and the Italians, we had to make an enormous effort to accept that the Poles and the Baltics were right and we were wrong. But once we have done it, public opinion and governments are basically safe. The question is, how fragile is the US concerned?
Okay, so these were at least 3 questions in this last intervention, and you promised me one.
Yeah, only one question. I would ask your point of view about the new upstream in the oil and gas of a Chinese company in Russia, no? It's very changed a lot, no? And not only pipeline, but really upstream, no? So look like a new Africa, no? That now China is enter now directly in Russia.
However you prefer. I'd be happy to go, or if Oksana.
Because I'm afraid this is going to be our last
Okay, then
round.
Oksana.
So maybe we can get Oksana. There were several questions. I don't know if you want me to summarize them for you. The option of direct confrontation with NATO, the war of narratives, what the regime change, if a regime change is not possible, what it means for the type of peace we can achieve. The US dimension, I suggest we leave for Kurt, and the energy issue.
Okay. Yes, okay. Well, first of all, I want to say that I fully associate myself with the last speaker, the last question, 100%. I totally agree with all which was said. I do not personally believe that we will be going into the lasting peace of the kind that Kurt very eloquently and extremely persuasively spoke about. But I just simply cannot imagine the circumstances in which Russia, particularly the Russia which has been brainwashed on a mega scale, is going to fully come to terms with its past, its crimes, pay reparations back to Ukraine, which of course Ukraine fully deserves, and come to terms with its own borders. I just cannot imagine in any foreseeable future that kind of Russia emerging. In fact, if tomorrow something happens with President Putin, it is likely that a more radical kind of Weimar Russia type leader who is going to emerge in his wake, partly because precisely the second question of the propaganda has really succeeded to brainwash the population to the extent that their very identity is now linked, individual identity is linked with this discourse that Russia is fighting with the West, that Ukraine is only being used by the West as a proxy to attack Russia, that it is an existential war of survival for Russia, and that all the opinion polls, all focus groups are showing that the absolute majority of people are now fully buying this lie, this absolutely enormous lie, the big lie. And as you know, of course, the bigger the lie, the more likely it is that people buy it. And we've seen that in history many times. So whoever comes to power next after Putin would have to take into account that the population will be operating on the basis of this lie. And for every person who subscribed to this lie, admitting that it was a lie, will be a personal journey. It's not only a journey of the nation to come to terms with your past. It's a journey for individual. I have many family members and classmates, who are living in Moscow, and they all are in that category. Very educated people, lived in the West for many years, but they all are brainwashed fully. So it is very scary. And that is, I'm kind of going back to the question from Marta, what is the alternative scenario? I think safe to say that even if, Putin's view now that he is going to try to outlast the West and wait until, 2024 change of administration in Washington or next electoral cycle in Europe, etc., etc. Even if, he manages to outlast the Western unity, which at the moment I don't see likely. I think the unity will be preserved. Still in that situation, he cannot achieve that kind of strategic objectives that Kurt was talking about. That is, take control over entire Ukraine, remove government, get the Ukrainian people to accept Russian domination. This is now completely out of the question. So the only alternative scenario to a full victory of Ukraine, that is liberating all its lands, is precisely the scenario of the North Korea, South Korea, the kind of frozen conflict along a particular line. But unlike North Korea and South Korea, we have this line which is very long, and it's not only include the territory of Ukraine, of course, it will stretch along the entire NATO-Russia border. It will stretch from up in Finland all the way down to the Black Sea. And that's, going back to my point, that I made in my presentation, and I want to really underscore, unlike the Cold War, we have now completely demolished the entire infrastructure of confrontation with Russia that existed with the Soviet Union before. We have no arms control, we have no rules of engagement, we have no institutions, we have no hotlines, we have no understanding of red lines, we have nothing, so we need to really develop that, because we need to be prepared as an alternative to the victory of Ukraine, to very prolonged period of confrontation with a humiliated, revisionist, kind of Weimar style Russia, which will be preparing for the next hot war. They're not just going to give up. And we need to really think about what this confrontation is going to look like. Not only how much it's going to cost, but what it will involve and for how long.
Well, thank you very much. We have to remember some lessons, I think, that we have been trying to forget for the past 30 years. But hopefully we're not going back fully to a Cold War mode first.
That's what Marta said, what I was thinking, which is that in a way we already are in a Cold War mode, and we have to get out of it by winning. That's the way we have to think of it. There were two questions that are kind of on their own, and then I counted 5 other questions that are all kind of related. So let me deal with the 2 quickly and then talk a little bit about the remainder. First, on China, the last question that was asked. I wanted to add a comment to what else was said on China. China sees itself as the big brother in this partnership, not the little brother. And it doesn't want to be dependent on anything that the little brother does. This is not its interest. China has its own interests. It's going to pursue them the way it wants to pursue them. They have very different sets of interests than what Russia does. So every time we talk about, well, Russia and China teaming up, working together, you know, this is, the Chinese don't see it that way. They think of Russia more as a nuisance than they see it as a help. And anything they need from Russia, they can buy. And that is exactly the point about the pipeline and the oil. Okay, we'll buy it from you. That's great. That's in our benefit. You want us to give you arms to get involved in this war, and then that's going to reflect badly on us when we want the world to accept our claims on Taiwan. They're not going to do that, I don't think. They like to play this in-between role to keep us courting them, but it's not in their interest to be that closely tied to Russia. On the information wars, the simple answer to your question is we are not doing enough, clearly. Russia is devoting billions and billions of dollars to creating and pushing narratives to shape its view of the world, and we are not. And so we should not be promoting propaganda. That would be undermined very quickly, because it would lack the core of truth, which is what Russian propaganda lacks. But if we can push out information, push it into a Russian language space, push it into our own societies, you know, just continue. We need to do a lot more of that. Now, to the other set of issues, there's basically 2 sides of a coin. One of them, how does this war come out? Is there a ceasefire? Is there an end game or something? And the other one is, how does it come out for Putin? Is there a change in Russia? Is there not a change in Russia? How does that happen? So essentially, we have 2 timelines, and we don't know what comes first. Does the war end first in some way? Ukraine drives Russian forces out, or ends in some way? Or does Putin stumble, get removed, have a heart attack? Who knows? You know, but something in Russia first. Why do I put it that way? Because as long as Putin is in power, there is no ceasefire. There's no ceasefire, there's no end to the war, there's not, because he has staked his personal claim of leadership of Russia to success in recreating the empire. He will not stop, he will not back down. If there's any pause, it's literally that. It's only a pause while he tries to amass the forces to attack again. And that is what we saw already in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, 2017, 2022. There is no end to this as long as Putin's in power. So we have to figure out, first off, how do we help Ukraine end this more quickly by giving them the weapons? And there, I think everyone who spoke was urging the same thing. That's what we need to focus on, and that may come first, and that may cause the kind of soul searching in Russia that causes them to remove Putin. But it may not be first, and it may be what the gentleman who asked about sanctions is thinking of. And I'm reminded of my first job as an intelligence analyst, where what we had to do was write a summary of what was happening and then write our best judgment of what is the most likely thing in the future, what's likely to happen. And I found myself every day writing that the most likely thing is exactly what's happening today. That is just going to be a continuation of current events, one after the other. Continuation of the same trends that we see. And then I realized that that's right every single time until the day it's wrong. And the trick is not to predict the most likely thing, it's to try to figure out when is it going to change? What's going to cause it to change? You put your finger on one, which is aviation. Oksana put her finger on some others as well too. The fact that 1 million people flee the country when he comes up with a scheme for mobilization, that tells you the people know something is up. The fact, as I learned over the weekend, Putin doesn't use the public entrances to the Kremlin anymore. He only goes in through the secret in and outs elsewhere. When he sits down at meetings, he's very careful about how close he is to anybody that's there. And on and on and on. There are all these indicators that everybody knows something's wrong. We don't know what the trigger is. Is it the airplane crash? Is it a defeat of Russian forces somewhere on the ground in Ukraine? You know, cutting off Crimea. Is it the lack of availability of luxury goods, and people have finally had enough? And some kind of protest. Who knows what it would be? But there's enough pressure in the system now that I think we can be pretty confident it's going to change. We just don't know how or when. And in the meantime, what we should be doing is accelerating our assistance to Ukraine. I don't think it rests on occupying Moscow to get that soul searching. I think defeat can take other forms. I don't think that there are borders other than international borders. There might be pauses in the fighting, but Putin's not going to stop fighting as long as he's there. And once he's no longer there, I think that gives us a fresh opportunity or a fresh thing to talk about. And the final point I'll make when we're talking about urgency and accelerating assistance, I worry that we in the West now have a sense of complacency. Here we are over a year after Russia's invasion in February of 22, and Ukraine is still standing and still free. Zelensky's still president. So we look at this with some satisfaction and say, we did a good job. We helped Ukraine. They're still there. And I think that is a very wrong way of thinking. Ukraine is standing first and foremost because of the determination of the Ukrainian people. And secondly, because of the arms that we gave them. But we gave them arms and support slowly and grudgingly and one step at a time. And Ukraine survived despite that. Not because of that, but in spite of the way we did it, they still survived. And if we repeat what we did last year, again this year, I'm afraid that we are giving Putin time. Time to use resources en masse at his disposal. We need to compress the timelines, correct the mistakes that we made last year, give the Ukrainians everything we can as quickly as we can to push this to conclusion as quickly as we can. And that is the thing that will eventually reestablish peace and an equilibrium.
Thank you very much. Because this is the Transatlantic Forum, and I feel this remains unaddressed. You will have to tell us what do you think will happen in the US in terms of the US-Ukraine policy. Because this is that one of the big unknowns, and a lot of Europeans fear. They fear the elections in 2 years' time. They fear that we may
lose our resolve gradually.
Well, I knew Ricardo would not forget that I ignored that part of his question, but I thought maybe you would. But but essentially, right now, we have a substantial majority of Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate who fully support Ukraine, who are very happy to put sanctions and pressure on Russia, and are making the case publicly for public opinion, saying we need to support Ukraine. I think this is a sustainable situation for about a year. We will get into a situation in the next year, about a year from now, where the presidential election dynamics will start to take over. And in the presidential election, we already have Donald Trump as a declared candidate, and he will be making the case that we shouldn't be spending so much money on Ukraine. It's a Europeans' problem. They should be doing this. Why is it us? Why is, Biden administration is not putting America first? That's the kind of argument he's going to make. That will resonate with about 20 to 30% of the public, which is dangerous because right now that's not an issue, but it's going to resonate when he does that. That will then put pressure, particularly on Republican members of Congress, to watch what they say so they don't cross their constituents who are now getting more isolationist. So it's going to create a dynamic in the system. All of the other presidential candidates will be in favor of support of Ukraine and pressure on Russia, Republican and Democrat. No one's going to come out like Trump will. And even the most likely alternative to Trump on the Republican side, who today appears to be Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, even he is careful not to oppose aid to Ukraine. He has taken the line of accountability. We need to have transparency and accountability, no blank check. We need to know where the money's going. That's a safe space that sounds conservative. And so he's adopted that, and he'll try to stick to that. Trump will push him on this. We don't know how the electoral dynamics will go. One scenario is that even Republican voters say, okay, we had Trump, now we need somebody new. So they like America first, but they don't want somebody in the late 70s, and they don't want the Trump with all the baggage, and they'll think he's the most likely of any of them. He's the most likely to lose because he'll draw all the opposition. So that's one scenario. The other scenario, and that would favor Ron DeSantis, or if DeSantis starts to go down, somebody like Nikki Haley or someone else. On the other hand, there is the scenario where Trump captures a majority of the Republican electorate because he is the real thing. Why vote for Trump light when you can get Trump? So if he captures that electorate, then I think we run a risk of a repeat of the 2020 election of Trump and Biden. And it's very hard to predict where that goes this time.
In any case, Ukraine is going to be a center stage for us here in Europe, maybe less so for you in the US. But I think this is why now is the moment to give the floor to Hanna Hautunko from the Ukrainian embassy. And I want to thank my panelists right before we finish the panel, because I think you were great. Thank you very much to you and to Oksana.
Thank you, Vasilya.
Excellencies, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to speak to this distinguished audience. It's an honor to be here. Today's gathering is more than a meeting between officials and experts. It is a meeting of true friends and partners. I'm glad to acknowledge you all here in this conference room are true supporters of Ukraine in our existential fight. My country has been ravaged. Our hospitals have been bombed. Our citizens have been executed. Our children have been traumatized and terrorized by bombing and drone attacks. But Ukraine has done a magnificent job defending its sovereignty against Russian unprovoked invasion. We have preserved Ukrainian freedom. We are protecting the values of Ukraine and Europe. Thanks to everyone who is fighting. Thanks to everyone who helps us fight. First and foremost, I would like to thank all distinguished speakers for their excellent, thought-provoking talks. It will probably be a day or two before we can consolidate our own personal perspectives on this issue. I would briefly like to review some of these main points during our deliberation. The one overriding message is that a 21st century war in Europe led by nuclear power is pushing the global security architecture to be rethought. President Putin hoped the invasion of my country would split the West. Instead, the scale of the transatlantic response to the war, from energy diversification to sanctions to migration management, has demonstrated that the international community has remained united with Ukraine. Our partners and friends have presented a united front, standing firmly with Kyiv. In a way, Ukraine has brought the European Union, Europe together like never before. As said distinguished Kurt Volkel, Putin, war against Ukraine is war against Europe. The economic sanctions imposed by the EU and NATO allies and other countries have been swift and unprecedented in terms of scope, scale, and severity. The anti-Kremlin coalition became a strong, effective, and is growing. The recent decisions of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group will definitely strengthen our military capabilities at the decisive stage of the war. Tank coalition and sanction coalition are gaining momentum. Moreover, those new formats of cooperation and decision-making are shaping new realities, new approaches to tackling security challenges. Russia's decision to invade Ukraine has also appeared to strengthen Western allies. As was mentioned today, the European Union and NATO have a renewed sense of purpose. For example, two new members, Finland and Sweden, after decades of non-alignment, asked to join NATO as protection against Russia. Ukraine submitted its application to join the EU 1 year ago, on the 5th day of Russia's full-scale war, and has since become the EU candidate. Ukraine applied for the fast-track NATO membership. As President Zelensky emphasized, Ukraine has always been and will always be a part of Europe. For many years to come, we have secured this. Ladies and gentlemen, as was underlined by all distinguished speakers and especially Ambassador Dobryansky, Russia's invasion of Ukraine also triggered global concerns over the issue of energy security. For decades, Europe relied on Moscow for its supply of oil and gas. However, as President Zelensky said, the old European hope that economic ties would keep Russian tank columns from moving did not work. The invasion proved that Moscow could no longer be a reliable partner and supplier, promoting the continent to seek alternative sources of energy. The loss of Russian imports has increased awareness of the dangers of relying on geopolitical advisories for critical raw materials. Security and affordability will play a key role in national policies on energy security in years to come. Moreover, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has the potential to accelerate the global shift to green energy in the long run. The war against Ukraine has also brought attention to the issue of its implication for the rule of law. The war remains the most serious and unprecedented challenge to the international community since World War II. Russian troops systematically violate the norms of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine. The strategic need to hold Russia accountable for the crime of aggression is to prevent future wars and punish evil. The crime of aggression committed by Russian top political and military leadership against Ukraine poses a threat to the entire world community. Leaving its performance without punishment can be a dangerous sign that the world is dominated not by law, but by force. There is one more important issue that I would like to touch upon, environmental damage. Environmental damage in Ukraine caused by Russian war is estimated at more than 46 billion US dollars. Just one example, Ukraine has become one of the most mined countries in the world. 1/3 of Ukraine's territory requires the mining. This will require at least 5 years. Not to mention attacks and dangerous actions by the Russian Federation around Ukrainian nuclear power plants that continue to create the risk of an environment disaster. By concluding, allow me to draw your attention one more time to the fact that Russia has not changed its plans to destroy Ukraine. Every time Russia cynically calls for negotiations, its occupation forces do the exact opposite and try to go on the offensive. Ukraine continues to fight for freedom. We will fight for as long as it takes to win, because in the face of Russian genocide aggression, we have no choice but to win. The spring and early summer of this year will be decisive for the course of war. The speed of ending the war primary, as was mentioned by distinguished Curtis Walker and Oksana Antonenko, depends on timely military and technical assistance from our partners. We are deeply grateful to all our allies and states that are supporting us for their support. More support now means faster victory and peace. I would also like to invite you all to join and to contribute to peace and the rule of law by facilitating and promoting implementation of the peace formula plan proposed by President Zelensky. All 10 points of the plan are based on the principles of the UN Charter and guarantees of security and justice for the entire international community. It is our common interest to bring peace back as soon as possible. I thank you.
Usa la sua lingua madre, tanto abbiamo un collegamento. Vi preghiamo di rimanere seduti, grazie. Ecco qua.
Bene, grazie mille. Maybe we switch for this session from English to Italian, as you prefer. Yeah, it depends. Kurt is unable to follow in Italian, I guess. Maybe in Ukrainian. In case we switch to Italian. Okay. The title is NATO and the EU, NATO e Unione Europea. Ora io trovo queste cose istituzionali abbastanza noiose da discutere se non sei in un giro proprio di grande competenza tecnica. Per un convegno come il nostro, secondo me bastano le cose basiche. Abbiamo visto la guerra in Ucraina segna un grande rilancio della NATO, questo è evidente, e non è ancora chiaro come evolverà l'Unione Europea nel campo della sicurezza e difesa, ma un fattore chiave è la Germania, naturalmente, è la grande svolta tedesca, Zeitenwende, se dico giusto, la svolta epocale della Germania, 100 miliardi di dollari destinati alla difesa e l'obiettivo di raggiungere molto rapidamente il famoso 2%. C'è una polemica però su questa politica tedesca e parlarne con Victor Elbling, l'ambasciatore della Germania in Italia, è molto interessante perché una scuola di pensiero, e poi ringrazio Aurelio Regina per essere qui, e eccoci, Ian Lesser from Brussels. Hi Ian, I will talk in English with you, di essere qui anche, ma insomma c'è una grande polemica su questa storia della Germania perché secondo una scuola di pensiero questo sforzo tedesco non è veramente rivolto a creare una capacità europea, ma è rivolto a uno sforzo essenzialmente nazionale e transatlantico, cioè la Germania prende 100 miliardi di euro, compra gli F-35 perché non c'è molto altro da comprare, partecipa, diciamo così, a un sistema di difesa antimissile che è molto costruito sulla tecnologia americana, israeliana, eccetera. Quindi fino a che punto, primo, ci sono davvero questi 100 miliardi, perché poi si leggono delle cose abbastanza strane sulla stampa, tipo che il comitato che dovrebbe attuare, il comitato parlamentare che dovrebbe attuare tutto ciò, in realtà si è riunito solo una volta, non ci sono grandi progressi. Quindi vorrei prima di tutto sapere da te, Victor, cosa ne pensi sull'approccio. Cioè la Germania è diventata un paese completamente NATO first, non si preoccupa di costruire un'Europa della difesa o no, cosa che la distinguerebbe secondo molti dalla posizione francese, e come sta andando praticamente questa cosa, perché da quanto si legge sta andando molto lentamente. Lo dico anche perché noi sappiamo una cosa di cui abbiamo parlato poco nella sessione precedente, però da quello che sappiamo, diciamo così, come esperti, la vera priorità degli Stati Uniti è la competizione con la Cina sul teatro dell'Indo-Pacifico. Quindi fino a quando l'America rimarrà così risucchiata sul fronte europeo, e quando invece l'America ci chiederà, probabilmente dopo il 2024, di carry more of the burden su questo fronte europeo. Prego, Victor, tu hai la parola per primo.
Grazie Marta, buonasera a tutte e a tutti, grazie qui anche all'occasione di poter essere in questa sede con voi su questo tema che è il tema essenziale che in questo momento. Hai posto molte domande molto importanti, Marta. Forse la prima, diciamo, il quadro generale è che credo sia l'Italia che la Germania, probabilmente l'Unione Europea, veniamo da una tradizione di politica estera e di sicurezza basata sul soft power. No? Noi abbiamo pensato durante molti decenni che il soft power, il dialogo, lo scambio commerciale siano la base per portare avanti, diciamo, una cooperazione pacifica che porta benefici per tutti. Questa era la nostra base. Per un paese come la Germania, anche con la sua storia, naturalmente, periodo nazista, seconda guerra mondiale, eccetera, quello che è successo, quello che tu hai chiamato appunto la Zeitenwende, che è la parola che Scholz, il cancelliere, ha usato, che sarebbe qualcosa come un watershed moment, un cambio, così, una svolta epocale, così. È successa davvero, è davvero un cambio di mentalità enorme. Forse uno dei punti che lo rende più visibile è la posizione del Partito Verde. Il Partito Verde, che è cresciuto come un partito contro l'energia atomica da un lato, l'energia nucleare, ma dall'altro lato anche come il partito, il movimento che è sempre stato a favore della demilitarizzazione, del disarmamento, no? contro ogni tipo di militarizzazione, diciamo. Adesso abbiamo la situazione del Partito Verde, che come sapete in Germania fa parte del governo, e probabilmente il partito più vicino a un engagement sempre più forte dal punto di vista militare, anche quando si tratta delle armi per l'Ucraina. Questa è una svolta davvero enorme che è successa in Germania, nella mentalità tedesca, ed è vero che non siamo ancora alla fine di questa svolta, cioè l'implementazione di questa svolta, ecco, ci siamo ancora in mezzo. Credo che si sono fatti tanti passi, come sempre in Germania, qui siamo molto simili all'Italia, abbiamo sempre un dibattito molto vivo, interno, autocritico di quello che succede, il che io trovo che sia un bene, ma è vero che non abbiamo ancora raggiunto tutti i nostri obiettivi. Il tema dei 100 miliardi. 100 miliardi, se si pensa alle spese necessarie per mettere a posto e ricostruire un esercito tedesco che, posso dire anche in questa sede, è in una situazione davvero non ottima, dopo 30 o 40 anni che si pensava che la difesa tradizionale non fosse più necessaria, è una somma relativamente piccola, se si vuole, perché è una somma che si spende abbastanza velocemente. L'idea non è spenderle tutte in una volta, è avere a disposizione un budget per poter iniziare una strada di ammodernamento delle forze armate tedesche. Questo è vero, ci abbiamo messo un pochettino perché anche qualche cosa che è una novità nel sistema tedesco, ma devo dire che con il nuovo ministro della difesa Pistorius, scriviamo adesso, la cosa sta cominciando a andare velocemente. Perché? Perché gli aerei americani, non alternative, eccetera, credo che c'è un tema del tempo. Credo che quello che stiamo vedendo adesso in Ucraina, almeno in Germania, si legge in un modo che dice abbiamo bisogno di sicurezza ora, subito. Dobbiamo investire in sicurezza europea, in nuove piattaforme europee, soprattutto si parla dell'integrazione delle industrie di difesa, chiaramente bisogno di piattaforme interoperabili nuove, probabilmente con pochi European Champions, lì siamo nel centro della discussione, chi possono essere questi European Champions, così, ma sicuramente non potremo averne 40, abbiamo bisogno di pochi che siano forti e che siano interoperabili. Allora, lì siamo davvero all'inizio della discussione e come tutti sappiamo è una discussione complessa in ogni paese, no? Anche in Italia penso, anche in Francia, sicuramente anche in Germania. Allora lì siamo all'inizio di una strada, ma credo che la decisione di decidersi per armamenti, per materiali americani o israeliani piuttosto che europei ha più a che fare con la necessità di dire che ne abbiamo bisogno ora. Perché ne abbiamo bisogno ora? Perché abbiamo davanti alle nostre porte una guerra, cosa con la quale nessuno contava nel nostro modo di vedere le cose. Ultima cosa, un passo importante che si è fatto, a parte tutto quello che non voglio enumerare, che insomma, la Germania ha fatto in quanto a aiuti per l'Ucraina, che siamo almeno il terzo paese in quanto a cooperazione, secondo se contiamo anche le risorse che passano attraverso l'Unione Europea, ma metterei soprattutto il tema dei carri armati. Ecco, i carri armati siamo de facto adesso siamo una specie di leader della squadra per cercare di mettere insieme questi due battaglioni appunto di carri armati Leopard, che si è dimostrato un tema molto complesso, molto complicato, perché tutti coloro che chiedevano di essere molto veloci su questo poi dopo alla fine hanno dimostrato di non essere prontissimi a dare quello che mi avevano promesso. Comunque ci stiamo avanzando anche lì. Tutto questo per dire è un movimento complesso, siamo un paese complesso, difficile anche noi, ma credo che abbiamo fatto passi avanti molto importanti.
Grazie. Victor, ti faccio una follow-up question e poi darei la parola a Ian e poi l'ultima parte della nostra discussione con Aurelio. Hai sentito parte del primo panel e fondamentalmente ci sono state due posizioni sull'endgame. perché Riccardo Perisic ha parlato di un ceasefire, cioè alla fine l'unico esito che si potrebbe intravedere di questa lunga guerra è non un accordo di pace, perché le posizioni sono assolutamente distanti, ma forse un ceasefire alla coreana, lui ha detto, un tema che ha ripreso anche Kurt Volker, e poi invece Kurt Volker ha detto no, questo è impossibile perché non darebbe nessuna garanzia sul comportamento futuro della Russia se non c'è un cambio di... Fondamentalmente Kurt, a me almeno è perso così, ha detto se non c'è un regime change a Mosca non ci sarà nessuna soluzione possibile. Tu pensi che sull'endgame c'è un vero accordo Stati Uniti e Europa o no? Perché effettivamente Riccardo ha anche detto è meglio parlarne il meno possibile, perché se cominciamo a parlarne le differenze verranno fuori. Cosa pensi tu di questo? Come vedi lo sviluppo del... È un momento difficile da interpretare, c'è molta fog of war in questo momento, non sono chiare le cose sul terreno.
Io penso che sarebbe sbagliato adesso davvero cercare di prevedere quale sarà la fine. Siamo probabilmente, come diceva Churchill, alla fine dell'inizio, ma non ancora all'inizio della fine, siamo ancora abbastanza lontani, credo, da quella situazione. Abbiamo un anno dietro di noi dove le previsioni sono state ribaltate diverse volte, in diversi sensi. Tutti gli esperti si aspettavano una vittoria veloce dei russi, poi dopo un momento di stasi, poi nessuno si aspettava la controffensiva o offensiva degli ucraniani. Allora io credo che dire davvero quale sarà il punto, no, d'arrivo credo che sia praticamente impossibile. Allora io non ho il coraggio di dire, immagino questo, le mie idee, ma insomma sono as good as anyone's, no? Devo dire. Credo che lì bisogna stare molto, molto attenti e dare soprattutto davvero la parola agli ucraini, che sono quelli che sono stati aggrediti. È chiaro che tutti vogliamo la pace, una base comune, non c'è questione su di questo, ma è vero che vogliamo una pace che sia giusta e soprattutto una pace che duri in futuro. Non ci serve una pace che tra pochi anni si risulta di nuovo complicato. Credo che Paula Dobriansky oggi ha detto qualcosa di molto importante. Quello che questa guerra ha dimostrato è che chi rinuncia alle armi nucleari, come l'ha fatto l'Ucraina nel 1994, si trova davanti a problemi molto importanti. E quale messaggio è quello che esce da lì per il resto del mondo? A paesi come l'Iran, in paesi come la Corea del Nord, eccetera, eccetera, eccetera. Allora, quello è davvero qualcosa di molto, molto negativo. Allora, tutta l'architettura di sicurezza europea sicuramente, ma sicuramente mondiale anche, è messa in questione da questa guerra. Allora, penso che il tema di come sarà questa pace è davvero essenziale, è forse ancora più essenziale avere una pace subito.
Thank you very much, Victor. May I switch now to Ian? I see you in the screen, Ian. We are discussing in this second session the NATO-EU relationship. Still, I think that it is too boring to approach it in institutional vague terms. So we try to go through countries. Victor Elbling said very interesting things about Germany. I would ask you about Turkey, because after all, Turkey is a key NATO member, and still it's playing a role in itself, playing an important role in the Mediterranean, clearly, both in energy issues and in security terms. And my first question to you, what do you think about the role of Turkey in light of the war in Ukraine first? And then I would ask you to go back to the US. Please, Ian, you have the floor.
Okay, Marta, thank you very much. And my apologies for being with you, electronically rather than here in Rome, which would have been much preferable. Look, on Turkey, it's a multifaceted question, really, and I'll try not to be too boring in my answer, which is to say that, in part, this is about the war and what has happened in recent years, quite a part even before the war, but part of this is about changes in Turkey itself. And, I think Turkey at the moment is in a there's an election coming up, so there are questions about how durable any of this policy will be, but I think there are certain structural things here. I mean, Turkey is really at once a stakeholder in what has been happening over the last year. It's a stakeholder in a relationship with Russia that it finds it difficult to extricate itself from economically, politically, and in other ways. But obviously, it's also a key member of the NATO alliance. And, Turkey is exposed. Things can go wrong. The longer this conflict goes on, the chances of an incident escalating, the chances of something simply happening that we hadn't taken account of is a possibility. Many of these things are not just on the Polish border with Ukraine or in the Baltic. They're also in the Black Sea. They're also in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are many places where NATO allies and Russia can come into contact. There have been incidents in the past, of course, between Turkey and Russia. If you imagine the shooting down of a Russian aircraft that took place in 2015, imagine that against the background of what we have today. It would be very, very different for Turkey, different for NATO. Turkey is playing a very delicate game here. On the one hand, Turkey would like to see itself as at least a facilitator, if not a broker somehow, of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. In a limited sense, I think they've done that over the grain deal. But on the other hand, Turkey is very, very well aware that it is dependent on the NATO security guarantee, and especially if something were to go wrong. There's one area of this, and this relates also to the European Union, where Turkey is simply not on the same page, and that's when it comes to sanctions. Turkey is allergic to economic sanctions anyway. This is a long history going back to the relationship with Iraq and Iran and other things. And Turkey in many ways is clearly allowing a bit of an economic escape valve for Russia. This is obviously not a popular posture in Washington or in Brussels. So, it's a very difficult kind of game for Turkey to play in this kind of functional non-alignment that they aspire to, in a sense, which is maybe the instinct of President Erdogan himself and some of the people around him, but it's getting to be a harder and harder act to fulfill.
Thank you, Ian. And going back now to the US for a moment, because we listened to Kurt on the, if you wish, on the solidity of the American domestic front, which is in itself a very important point, especially looking to 2024. How do you read it? Because the radical, quote unquote, wings of both parties, Democrats and the GOP, seem to be more skeptical about the amount of aid to give to Ukraine for many different reasons, from the American first line to the idea that the real competition is with China, and this war is distracting resources to the European front. Which is your assessment on that?
Martha, thank you. And I heard Kurt's remarks earlier, and I largely agree with what he had to say. I think I would make a distinction between what the United States is doing and spending with regard to defense support for Ukraine, and also, of course, what the United States is doing in terms of its own defense budget. And that's likely to include all kinds of new spending on nuclear modernization and other things, driven in part by this increasingly tense relationship with Russia. I would distinguish between the support for that, which I would imagine will stay fairly strong on a bipartisan basis. And I could be wrong about that, but I think to date, that's largely been so. I think where it gets much more difficult is on the question of economic support for Ukraine. And if we think about the long-term demands for reconstruction in Ukraine, I think this is going to shape up to be another measure of burden sharing across the Atlantic. I think it's going to be very difficult for any American administration to justify large-scale support, economic support for Ukraine over the longer term, unless Europe is seen to be doing the lion's share of the contribution on that front. So I would distinguish there between the defense issues, which are driven by Russia and national defense concerns of our own, and this longer term support for economic reconstruction. Of course, China plays a role in this as well in terms of the perceptions about security and defense spending and so on. It's not just about Russia, but I think on the economic side, you know, the politics are going to get very complicated and relate very clearly to what is going to happen in the 2024 elections.
Yeah, I tend to think you're right. There is a difference between the two sides of the problem. And I tend to think myself that the burden of economic reconstruction will weight on European shoulders. Still, you also have some opportunities. And here I give the floor to Aurelio Regina per parlare, sì, di ricostruzione economica e di energia, due temi su cui l'Italia si è data abbastanza da fare in realtà. E in tutti e due i casi, se vuoi, l'idea che la crisi generi anche delle opportunità. Quindi la crisi energetica è stata pesante e può tornare anche a essere pesante per l'Italia. Non è che abbiamo del tutto lasciato alle spalle il periodo degli alti prezzi del gas, non sappiamo cosa succederà. Al tempo stesso abbiamo cominciato una rapidissima diversificazione delle fonti che è andata bene e che è stata importante. E lo stesso è un po' sulla ricostruzione futura, insomma, dell'Ucraina, dove da una parte ci sono dei costi enormi, di cui ha già parlato la leadership ucraina, e dall'altra ci sono una parte delle imprese italiane, hanno già fatto una missione con il ministro Urso e così via, che vedono le opportunità anche di una ricostruzione di un paese che è stato completamente, in gran parte, in una sua parte, distrutto dalla Russia. Devo dire che, se posso fare un passo indietro alla prima sessione, quello che mi colpisce della Russia è che dove la Russia non riesce a vincere, che è quasi dappertutto, distrugge. Ci sono delle fotografie che circolano in questi giorni sul grado di distruzioni di alcune città del Donetsk che sono veramente impressionanti. È proprio terra bruciata. È una cosa veramente terribile e tremenda da guardare. Quindi la ringrazio, ambasciatrice, poi per le sue parole di prima che sono veramente importanti. Aurelio.
Sì, grazie Marta. Allora, per provare a rispondere e a dare un contributo alla tua domanda in questo panel così autorevole, ne approfitto per ringraziare gli organizzatori di questo veramente interessante momento di confronto, in particolare l'Aspen e il Centro Studi Americani, nella figura dei loro presidenti, sono due enti a cui sono particolarmente e personalmente molto legato. Io provo a come dire, sottolineare qualche aspetto partendo dal tema energetico, perché il tema energetico abbiamo scoperto essere, diciamo, fondamentale per lo sviluppo del tema più allargato dello sviluppo industriale, della politica industriale europea, anche un po' per comprendere gli effetti, diciamo, di quella che è stata una guerra, in qualche modo, una guerra dei prezzi. Oggi nel panel precedente veniva affermato con una certa nettezza che tutti noi dobbiamo renderci conto che Putin non ha dichiarato solamente guerra all'Ucraina, ma l'ha dichiarata all'Europa. E questo è particolarmente vero se guardiamo, diciamo, agli aspetti sul fronte energetico, perché i prezzi dell'energia sono cominciati ad aumentare molto prima, diciamo, del 24 febbraio. E adesso, senza entrare in meccanismi molto tecnici, ci sono stati dei fattori congiunturali che hanno determinato il periodo di siccità in alcuni bacini idroelettrici, la mancata ventosità al nord d'Europa, il livello degli stoccaggi. Però in realtà si sa poco, diciamo, di uno degli effetti forse che ha avuto più importanza, che Putin, attraverso Gazprom, ha fatto mancare i volumi in eccesso di gas, quelli, diciamo, al di fuori dei contratti di lungo termine, che normalmente venivano destinati a bilanciare i mercati e le piattaforme elettroniche, li ha fatti gradualmente mancare dalle piattaforme elettroniche. Questo ha reso, diciamo, il TTF, quello diciamo, più popolare in questi mesi abbiamo imparato a conoscere, l'ha reso illiquido, e questo gradualmente, diciamo, ha spinto, diciamo, i prezzi verso l'alto fino ad arrivare poi all'invasione ucraina, dove si sono consolidati con dei picchi anche insostenibili. E questo dà la dimensione di come Putin abbia cercato, attraverso la politica energetica, un certo tipo di politica energetica, di condizionare la reazione europea e in qualche modo di sterilizzarne, diciamo, la reazione quando poi avrebbe invaso l'Ucraina. E in effetti per alcuni aspetti non c'è riuscito, ed è uno dei tanti fallimenti che possiamo annoverare, diciamo, a questo lungo elenco, diciamo, di effetti contrari che ha avuto la guerra, effetti contrari a quello che probabilmente Putin aveva messo, diciamo, nel suo scadenzario. Però certamente, diciamo, qualche effetto lo ha avuto. Innanzitutto ha avuto l'effetto di far emergere le differenze delle politiche europee degli Stati membri, perché, diciamo, improvvisamente ci siamo resi conto come molti degli Stati membri avessero delle proprie visioni di politica energetica differenti l'una dall'altra, che avevano reso difficile e rendono ancora difficile l'integrazione dei mercati, che è il vero obiettivo, diciamo, a cui dobbiamo tendere, cioè provare a creare un mercato unico integrato del gas. In alcuni casi, anche lo dico anche per i tedeschi, certamente i tedeschi erano molto più impauriti, forse ancora più di noi, che non ce ne siamo resi conto di quale sarebbe stato l'effetto di una mancanza di gas per il sistema industriale. Mi sono confrontato tante volte con i colleghi della BDI, della Confindustria tedesca, proprio per capire, no? E questo, diciamo, poi si è reso plasticamente noto nell'ostilità della Germania, per esempio, a portare avanti la proposta italiana di Mario Draghi del price cap. Quanta fatica abbiamo fatto per portare avanti, che era dovuta in maniera comprensibile, diciamo, proprio alla paura di una mancanza di gas sul mercato europeo. Poi alla fine è arrivato un compromesso, che è un compromesso certamente modesto, che ha avuto i suoi effetti sulla riduzione del gas, però certamente, diciamo, non è questo così importante. Oggi abbiamo dei livelli di prezzo certamente più sostenibili, sono sempre, diciamo, il doppio, due, tre volte quelli, diciamo, storici del periodo, diciamo, pre-Covid, tanto per intenderci, quindi ancora, diciamo, sono prezzi sostenuti, ma certamente molto lontani. Io mi sbilancio a dire, non le faccio mai previsioni che riguardano, diciamo, i prezzi, perché per paura soprattutto di portare male, ma tendenzialmente il futuro, diciamo, non tanto quest'anno, che è ancora un anno molto incerto per una serie di fattori tecnici, ma certamente gli anni a venire vedranno un afflusso di gas importante in Europa, e quindi, diciamo, è legittimo aspettarsi che i prezzi o rimangano così o addirittura, diciamo, si riducano. Questo è importante perché naturalmente toglie una delle armi probabilmente sui quali Putin contava più di tutti, proprio nel confronto europeo. Quindi questo è importante valutare, tant'è vero che già oggi la Russia, né Putin né nessuno diciamo, degli spokesperson fa dichiarazioni sul gas o minacce, diciamo, di mancanza di gas, perché sa che sono ininfluenti e non solo sono difficilmente realizzabili, ma hanno poco effetto poi sulla determinazione dei prezzi. Il clima, diciamo, della politica energetica ha fatto emergere anche un altro aspetto, cioè l'altro aspetto è che tutta questa diciamo, crisi energetica avviene nel momento in cui l'Europa prende una direzione, che peraltro in parte anche gli Stati Uniti, verso il cambiamento climatico e verso, diciamo, una trasformazione del proprio modello energetico, che non è solo una trasformazione del proprio modello energetico, guardate, lo dico da rappresentante industriale, è una trasformazione totale di come viene consumato, prodotto e trasformato l'energia, e quindi ha un impatto sui sistemi industriali rivoluzionario. Cioè noi siamo davanti a una rivoluzione equiparabile a quella industriale probabilmente, perché il processo sarà profondo. La rivoluzione dei prezzi avviene contemporaneamente, mentre ci diamo degli obiettivi molto sfidanti, perché gli obiettivi rivisitati del Fit for 55 sono pesanti, no? In questo contesto e hanno degli impatti naturalmente anche per quanto riguarda poi gli Stati Uniti. Volevo dire qualcosa?
No, volevo dire proprio quando noi decidiamo che devono costare di più le fonti fossili, no? Per gli obiettivi ambientali che tu dici.
Sì, la transizione poi ha evidenziato, diciamo, tutta una serie di incongruenze, no? Perché noi da una parte chiediamo alle industrie di pagare i certificati della CO2 e allo stesso tempo autorizziamo le centrali a carbone a produrre più energia. Cioè, diciamo, abbiamo messo in atto, diciamo, in una fase anche un po' emergenziale, una serie di comportamenti sclerotici che ci portano proprio a dire che oggi l'Europa ha una grande responsabilità, no? Una grande responsabilità di definire la sua politica energetica, di uscire dagli egoismi, perché oggettivamente questi un po' l'hanno fatto da padrone nei decenni precedenti, partendo da una premessa, diciamo, poi di fondo. Oggi per una politica energetica che si rispetti occorrono 3 fattori. La sostenibilità di una politica ambientale in linea, diciamo, con la visione anche europea. La seconda, la sicurezza degli approvvigionamenti, e la terza, l'ottimizzazione dei costi. Sulla seconda e sulla terza, noi ci siamo illusi, ed è stata un'illusione collettiva, che noi potessimo avere per decine di anni un gas a un prezzo modico in quantità enormi. E lo abbiamo fatto affidandoci, diciamo, a un provider che poi si è rivelato non particolarmente affidabile. Invece, diciamo, l'Europa si è spostata tutta sul primo fattore. Oggi ci rendiamo conto che agire solo su un solo fattore, non anche sugli altri 2, significa trovarsi in difficoltà molto serie. Ecco perché, diciamo, ci stiamo orientando, poi lo possiamo affrontare, su una politica di diversificazione che cambia anche l'assetto geopolitico europeo e non solo europeo, che ha delle implicazioni certamente non banali, perché spostare l'asse di approvvigionamenti da nord-est a sud o a sud-est, perché voglio dire c'è anche la TAP che dà, diciamo, un rifornimento, e porsi, diciamo, una nuova visione anche col piano, o chiamiamo del nuovo piano Mattei, di visione, diciamo, in cui l'Italia funge da hub per tutto il resto dell'Europa, è una visione che certamente cambia gli assetti geopolitici e quindi anche rispetto a un sistema di sicurezza e di difesa nazionale vanno fatte adeguate riflessioni.
Molto, molto interessante. Io, visto che siamo nel forum transatlantico, abbiamo parlato di tutti gli aspetti prima militari, di sicurezza, parliamo allora della gamba economica ed energetica introdotta così bene da Aurelio Regina, perché secondo me è difficile che un'alleanza così stretta come quella che abbiamo in testa fra Stati Uniti ed Europa possa reggersi solo sulla gamba della NATO. Secondo me ci vuole anche un solido accordo economico transatlantico. Ora, non è facilissimo, e qua la domanda vale per tutti e tre, perché come sapete meglio di me, con l'IRA, l'Inflation Reduction Act, in fondo l'America ha introdotto una propria posizione molto precisa di sostegno al Made in America, alla propria industria. In realtà è possibile un accordo sull'IRA, c'è una missione di Ursula von der Leyen in questi giorni, c'è stato il viaggio del ministro dell'economia di Germania e Francia, insomma lì si può trovare un certo tipo di accordo e che tipo di risultato ideale vorremmo? Un nuovo TTIP, una cosa di questo genere? Prego, Vittor.
Sì, abbiamo sicuramente bisogno di un accordo commerciale costruito sulle nuovi obiettivi che abbiamo, no? È stato appena detto il tema del cambio climatico e l'energia pulita, che agli americani non piace molto spesso, ai conservatori, sentire la parola energia verde, ma l'energia pulita che non mi piace di più, ma lì sono quasi tutti d'accordo che bisogna investire. Allora questo sarà sicuramente un tema centrale. Allora, dal lato positivo, secondo me si critica un po' troppo il tema dell'IRA dal punto di vista europeo, perché è un bene che gli americani vogliono investire pesantemente nell'energia pulita. Questo è molto importante. Quello che naturalmente ci piace di meno è che si cerca di trovare una base industriale per questo esclusiva negli Stati Uniti. Anche lì quelli che fanno parte delle filiere, vengono dall'Europa, ne possono approfittare, portando, no, i loro prodotti verso gli Stati Uniti. Però ci piacerebbe chiaramente avere qualche cosa dove sia chiaro che siamo in una fase dove assieme dobbiamo produrre questo tipo di prodotti. Io penso che sia possibile arrivare a un accordo con gli Stati Uniti su di questo. Allora io non sono così scettico in quanto a questo punto. Non credo che il primo obiettivo degli Stati Uniti con l'IRA sia di nuocere all'Europa. Non è tanto questo. Credo che sono tre obiettivi. C'è l'obiettivo della sicurezza propria, pensando soprattutto anche alla Cina, lo stesso come il CHIPS Act, eccetera. C'è il tema dell'energia pulita sicuramente, e anche il tema del finanziamento. Sono tutti e tre gli obiettivi classici del tema della politica energetica. Ma volevo dire una frase sul tema delle differenze che ci sono in Europa. È vero, veniamo da una tradizione in Europa dove il concetto che l'energy mix si fa in modo nazionale è stato accettato da tutti durante decenni, cioè, come anche nella salute, no? Prima della pandemia. Tutti hanno detto no, questi sono temi che naturalmente non li lasciamo in mano alla Commissione europea, li facciamo a livello nazionale. Poi arriva il tsunami del problema, come con la pandemia, adesso con questa guerra, e ci rendiamo conto che non siamo più in grado di fare 27 politiche nazionali in quanto all'energia. E ci sono molti temi, secondo me, da risolvere in questo. Tutta la discussione sul price cap ha sicuramente a che fare con questo, perché ognuno di noi ha necessità completamente diverse, no? L'industria tedesca è basata pesantemente sul gas naturale, per tutta l'industria pesante, la chimica, l'acciaio, no? L'automobile, tutta basata sull'energia che viene dal gas. Da qui le differenze di vedute naturali, secondo me, che si possono risolvere se diciamo no, abbiamo bisogno di una politica energetica comune e soprattutto di connessioni sia nell'elettrico che per il gas che siano comuni a tutti. Poi vedremo se con l'idrogeno ce la facciamo, c'è bisogno di grandi investimenti in questo senso. Ma per tornare alla tua domanda, io credo che sia necessario trovare una soluzione congiunta. Avevi chiesto prima, nella prima parte, sull'Unione Europea versus NATO, no? Allora, io credo che siamo davvero in una nuova fase, nel senso che la comunità di valori d'Occidente, dico Occidente, per l'Occidente che continua poi anche dall'altra parte del globo, cioè alla Corea del Sud, al Giappone, all'Australia, alla Nuova Zelanda, eccetera, ci obbliga a unirci in modo diverso da quanto lo facevamo prima. Forse lo sguardo molto forte degli Stati Uniti verso la Cina ci aiuta anche in questo senso, ma quello che sicuramente abbiamo bisogno è di un'unità transatlantica molto molto forte, in tutti i sensi, economicamente e politicamente.
Grazie Vittor, penso che qui siamo proprio d'accordo, Aspen, Centro Studi Americani, l'idea che le democrazie occidentali e l'European Council for Foreign Relations in una fase come questa debbano riuscire ad unirsi. Ian, two questions for you. First, on this economic track of the transatlantic bargain, do you think that something like a mini new TTIP or something like that, would it possible or not? And second, yes, the West must become much more cohesive, and then you have the rest. And so how can you bring more countries into the fold, in a sense? Which kind of soft power can be effective enough to enlarge this notion of the West? Because the problem of the West is, yes, we are becoming more cohesive. At the same time, we are losing influence at the world level. How can we regain a bit of influence towards the global South? And then I will end with you, Aurelia, and I will end with a message of the Italian Minister for Foreign Affairs. Prego, Ian, the floor is yours again.
Okay, Marta, to your question, but also to some of the bigger themes that I think come out of the comments we've just heard for the last minutes. Look, I mean, we talked about how risk is back, war is back. Well, there are other things that have come back. The state is back. It's not just a result of what's happened over the last year. We can go back to the 2008 economic crisis. We can go back to the COVID crisis. The energy crisis is part of it. The state is back. Industrial policy is back. Also on the American side of the equation, where it hasn't always been as popular as it has been, in Europe. And so we have to grapple with this, and it produces a lot of ironies. There's the irony of having this extraordinarily close cooperation on security issues across the Atlantic in the last period, accompanied by all sorts of unresolved tensions on trade, regulatory matters. You think about not just IRA, but also differences over digital policy and other things. These are not so easy, even fundamental trade issues. These are not so easy to resolve. Yeah, I do think it shows us how unfortunate it is that we don't have something like TTIP. Now, I think probably we wouldn't have gotten into the same difficulty over IRA if we did have something like it. I'm confident actually that this will be resolved in some fashion. But of course, one has to understand, another irony, to have the United States follow, in a sense, in a public policy way, along lines for energy transition and climate policy that Europeans would like to see the United States take, required certain political compromises to sell this internally at that scale in the United States. And unfortunately, these Buy American provisions are part of that. So I think we're never going to get away from these tensions entirely, but I think we face some really new challenges because, again, it's not just a matter of private sector policy. The state really is back. Industrial policy is back. Now, you talk about the global South. My sense is that in Washington, certainly with this administration, there's a recognition that you simply cannot expect complete consensus globally, even around something so clear-cut as the Russian aggression in Ukraine. My own perception is that most countries in the global South, in terms of its ethics, in terms of its legality, they are on the same page with the West. But when you get beyond that, in terms of the specifics of Russia policy and sanctions regimes, there it breaks down. And I think there is generally a desire, in some cases it's driven by historical images, other things, to have a more independent policy. And so you see this kind of functional non-alignment, a kind of moral and legal agreement with the West, but not an agreement on strategy, not an agreement on sanctions, not an agreement on other aspects of policy. And I'm sure we're going to face more of those challenges in the future, not least very big looming ones to do with China.
Grazie, Ian. Per citare lo European Council on Foreign Relations, Ivan Caster wrote a very brilliant piece on the FT, saying that after all, these countries are not pro-Russians, are only opportunistic, if you wish, or they consider Russia not important enough to be rebalanced. So it's, in a sense, according to Ivan, who is a pillar of the European Council on Foreign Relations, it is not at all a vast sympathy for Russia. It is the opposite. Russia is seen as a secondary power, and this war in Ukraine, which is so important to all of us, is not seen by them as their own war. And this is the difficulty in a sense. Ma concludiamo allora con Aurelio su questo punto. Qual è l'agenda vera di un dialogo che ci vada bene nell'economia fra Stati Uniti ed Europa? Victor diceva, di fronte all'IRA abbiamo esagerato, noi abbiamo avuto una reazione quasi esagerata, perché in fondo cosa impedisce a un'impresa europea di andare a produrre in Texas, di prendere anche lei crediti fiscali? È un problema se produciamo energia clean in America Ci dobbiamo difendere o dobbiamo cooperare? Come la metti tu?
Guarda, io credo che la reazione europea e anche italiana, diciamo, all'Inflation Reduction Act è avvenuta anche in un momento in cui lo sbilanciamento dei prezzi dell'energia tra Stati Uniti ed Europa e in particolar modo anche con l'Italia era talmente alto che naturalmente una politica di sussidi così forte che si aggiungeva anche a uno svantaggio competitivo importante, perché noi siamo arrivati a dei sbilanciamenti in cui il prezzo dell'energia era sì, 3-4 volte, 5 volte o 10 volte diciamo quello del 2019, ma lo sbilancio con gli Stati Uniti era ancora maggiore, quindi abbiamo il gas negli Stati Uniti che è a 5-6 dollari, no? Contro oggi il minimo storico, dove siamo ritornati indietro diciamo di un anno e mezzo, quasi al pre-inizio diciamo della guerra commerciale, siamo intorno ai 40 euro al megawattora, quindi nonostante questo rientro io credo anch'io che ci sia stata quindi una reazione un po' eccessiva, diciamo. Però detto questo, io poi peraltro faccio proprio una breve parentesi, cioè io trovo che quel piano, che naturalmente viene definito come un piano per la riduzione dell'inflazione, perché in America, come sappiamo tutti, gli americani sentono probabilmente più forte di noi la paura di avere un'inflazione alta, no? E quindi basta parlare con gli economisti americani per dire noi faremo, io ho sentito dire ad alcuni incontri riservati di banchieri, faremo qualsiasi cosa anche a costo di una recessione grave, no, dell'economia, cosa che noi facciamo un po' più fatica a dire in Europa, proprio perché loro hanno una forte paura e quindi un piano di questo genere l'hanno etichettato sotto, però credo che anche qualsiasi economista sa che ridurre o provare a ridurre l'inflazione aumentando il debito sia poco produttivo, no? E quindi quello è un grande piano di sostegno alla trasformazione energetica che va preso, come ha detto il ministro Giorgetti proprio in una riunione Aspen qualche giorno fa, come una grande sveglia per l'Europa. Ecco, questo va considerato un'opportunità per l'Europa di riflettere, che io mi auguro che l'Europa non risolva, diciamo, questo tema solamente all'interno del dibattito del WTO, ma che lo guardi con un'ottica di dimensione industriale e quindi diciamo si porti l'Europa anche stimolata diciamo da questo stimolo esterno a ragionare sulla sua dimensione europea. Cioè qui il fulcro della questione, il prossimo futuro dei nostri paesi, dei nostri sistemi, in particolare Italia e Germania, che sono quelli più industriali e più importanti da questo punto di vista, si reggerà su come sapremo costruire la nuova dimensione europea e come sapremo coniugare la transizione energetica collegata. Questo è il futuro. Io credo che poi confrontarsi con sistemi come quelli degli Stati Uniti, amici, sia solo diciamo, un'opportunità. Diciamo, naturalmente dobbiamo fare tante cose. Dobbiamo fare le cose che diceva l'ambasciatore, cioè costruire dei percorsi, abbattere le barriere, costruire dei sistemi integrati dell'energia, ma dobbiamo anche dare una dimensione più globale a quelli che sono gli aiuti di Stato, concentrare gli aiuti di Stato nelle poche attività che in qualche modo diciamo, strategiche per l'Europa e dobbiamo soprattutto, e questo lo dico proprio concludendo, guardare al futuro dell'Europa e della politica ambientale in un'ottica di neutralità tecnologica, cioè pensare ancora di immaginarci un'Europa fondata tutta sull'ideologia e poco diciamo sulla visione industriale, io credo che non ci porti da nessuna parte.
Molto interessante, Vittor. E giustificati sul fatto che gli aiuti di Stato sono nazionali invece che esserci un fondo europeo.
Allora, sai che sia il Fondo Monetario Internazionale che la Commissione Europea hanno detto da decenni che la Germania spende troppo poco, investe troppo poco, il che è vero. Se uno guarda le ferrovie, le strade, i ponti in Germania, c'è molta necessità di investimento. Abbiamo speso troppo poco, abbiamo risparmiato troppo, adesso spendiamo di più e anche quello viene criticato, anche quello non va tanto bene. Allora, normalmente l'idea economica è che quelli che se lo possono permettere è bene che spendano di più perché funziona bene per tutti. Chiaro che poi nella comunicazione si può sicuramente anche migliorare. No, ma quello che volevo dire è un'altra cosa. Volevo dire, che non è che noi, comparati con l'IRA e altre cose, noi in Europa siamo degli argentini che non facciamo sussidi, noi abbiamo messo il Next Generation EU, sono 750 miliardi che abbiamo buttato dentro il sistema, voglio dire, se prendiamo tutti i sussidi che noi prenderemo su e spenderemo anche per il Fit for 55, anno per anno, che non sono tutti pubblici, anche alcuni privati, una buona parte privata, ma anche solo quelli pubblici, insomma abbiamo più di quello che spendono gli americani. Attenzione.
Marta, mi fai dire solo una cosa
Sì,
perché
sì, ma sono
credo
d'accordo.
che sia importante anche per
Sì.
capire la grande opportunità che noi abbiamo davanti, se sapremo indirizzare in un certo modo. Il 21 di marzo, come Confindustria, presentiamo al governo uno studio dell'impatto economico del Fit for 55 in Italia, che ci dice, ve lo anticipo, quindi prima ancora di dirlo a loro, tanto insomma, siamo tra pochi amici, che noi dovremo spendere da qui al 2030 come paese, come sistema Italia, non solo industriale, parlo di industrie e cittadini, 1.100 miliardi di euro, diciamo da qui. Siccome abbiamo fatto poco, sono concentrati diciamo in 8 anni, quindi 150 miliardi all'anno. Un'enormità in termini di opportunità, però se saremo capaci naturalmente di indirizzarle con una politica industriale che valorizza i fattori di forza e non punti tutto su un'unica tecnologia che ci porta, diciamo, invece inevitabilmente ad aiutare altri e non l'Europa.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Ian. You rightly said industrial policy is back, which is true also in Europe. This is the point made by Victor. We also gave a lot of subsidies. The point is that in Europe, we tend to give money according to national priorities more than a European general scheme. And so the idea is that in Italy, certainly we have to move to a more European-like approach to the industrial policy. In stronger countries like Germany, national recipes are always important. In your country, I was reading the other day, there are very strange phenomena because, for instance, Texas, which is a state ideologically, if you wish, against climate change, clean energy, the oil state par excellence, they are producing much more clean energy than in California, no? Isn't it?
Yeah, no. I mean, look, my country always produces lots of strange phenomena that we can discuss, but let me just leave you with a final thought on exactly this, Marta, which is to say that I think, you know, just thinking about the tension between national and European level policies, it's also a question of how the United States relates to these things. If we're going to try to get some of these differences over things like IRA out of the way, I think there is a window of opportunity with this administration, because unlike many of its predecessors of actually either party, it actually takes the European Union seriously as an institution, as an interlocutor. That's, you know, been true on many fronts. And so, you know, that's not always going to be the case.
There is even an ambassador in Brussels to the EU. In Italy, we're far from that.
Well, we have a very good one at the moment. And, you know, when it comes to things like sanctions and many other issues, it's not an easy job, obviously. But, you know, this administration really does take it very, very seriously. And it makes a difference. Yeah, I think that's an asset. But, you know, it doesn't relieve us of the responsibility of fixing some of these problems.
The first test will be whether we will get, as Europe, the same kind of treatment as the Mexico, etc., according to the IRA, or not. Because
yeah, I mean, that will be it. And by the way, of course, that agreement is not universally popular in the United States in many places. But, you know, it has, like, you know, many, you know, especially with this question of friendshoring and decoupling and all these things we haven't spoken about directly. These places are, in fact, including Canada, extremely important for the United States. So, you know, this is just structural. It's not a bad thing.
The agreement with Mexico and Canada was made by Trump, isn't it?
Well, it was made
The second
many
one.
administrations ago. It was renamed by Trump.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, let me conclude this way, that as there is a story going on, a joke in the US, according to which in front of the two P, the most important one is the powers P and not the Putin's one. We spend the entire day to show that this is not true. The two Ps are equally important. So security and the economy must go together if we wish, as we wish, to build up a stronger West. We can put it this way. Looking at the West, which is larger than Europe and America, still the West must have a core within, and we hope as Europeans that the US and the EU and the single European countries are able to be the core of this larger West. Grazie a tutti. Io devo leggere il messaggio del Ministro degli Affari Esteri che si scusa moltissimo, ma aveva un impegno concorrente a Padova. Il succo del messaggio è che l'Italia è fermamente a favore delle operazioni che stiamo facendo in Ucraina. La guerra in Ucraina, scrive il Ministro su questo messaggio, che sarà messo anche sul sito del Centro Studi Americani e magari anche su quello di Aspen, dello European Council. Ve lo riassumo un po' con il permesso del direttore. Nessuno si può muovere mentre viene letto un messaggio del Ministro degli Esteri italiano, questo. Però lo sintetizzo un po'. La guerra in Ucraina ci pone davanti a molte sfide di respiro globale. Il nostro sentiero è però chiaramente tracciato. La posizione del governo italiano è inequivocabile. La nostra sicurezza, stabilità e prosperità non possono essere assicurate che dal rispetto della legalità internazionale. In questo la partnership transatlantica, forte della sua granitica identità di valori, si è dimostrata e continua a dimostrarsi solida e compatta, dando prova di lucidità, pragmatismo ed equilibrio. Chi aveva scommesso sulle nostre fragilità e divisioni ha commesso un errore strategico. L'unità che continuiamo a mantenere anche sulle sanzioni fa parlare ora di una vera e propria coalizione delle sanzioni che non scenderà a compromesse. Il Ministro continua dicendo che le sfide che abbiamo davanti non si esauriscono in Ucraina né in Europa, parla dell'instabilità, dell'insicurezza alimentare, della vulnerabilità degli approvvigionamenti energetici e torna sull'argomento così, per questo è così importante il rapporto col sud del mondo, parla del rapporto fra NATO e Unione Europea che si stanno muovendo con visione e decisione e parla dell'Italia che vuole essere protagonista su tutti questi fronti, rafforzando il suo ruolo di hub energetico in Europa, come diceva prima Aurelio Regina, ma dice che è uno sforzo corale che tutto il paese sta compiendo, il governo, le forze armate, le imprese e l'università, e che tratterà anche di ricostruzione dell'Ucraina. Fa una finale riferimento alla presidenza del G7 nel 2024, che sarà l'occasione per riuscire a rilanciare un'azione internazionale a favore dell'Ucraina e per riguadagnare terreno nel sud globale. Le ultime 3 righe vi leggo. Il governo italiano continuerà a dare il suo importante contributo investendo nel rapporto transatlantico che da oltre 70 anni è la stella polare dell'azione esterna del nostro paese. Antonio Tajani, Roma 6 marzo 2023, ore 18:15. Vi ringrazio moltissimo, al prossimo anno.